Before the moon lit our nights, something else ruled the skies. Forgotten empires, star-born architects, and beings so old they make Atlantis look like a startup. This isn't sci-fi, a tour through the deepest myths, wildest theories, and strangest anomalies ever buried beneath time. What if the moon wasn't always there? And what if entire civilizations lived and died before it arrived? Welcome to the untold history of the pre-lunar world. This is civilizations that may have lived before the moon appeared. Before we dive deep, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this descent into forgotten time. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Midnight? Sunrise? Somewhere in between? Let's see how far across space and time this story travels. Atlantis. The first thing you need to understand about Atlantis is this. It was never supposed to be a real place. At least, not according to Plato. And yet, 2,400 years later, we're still obsessed, still diving, still dreaming, still trying to find a continent that may have never existed. And in the process, something much stranger has emerged. A question not just of where Atlantis went, but when it might have lived. Because hidden in all the myths, mistranslations, and metaphors is a whisper, a dark suspicion that maybe, just maybe, Atlantis didn't sink beneath the waves after some petty war with Athens. Maybe it disappeared in a time before even the moon was hanging in the sky. Maybe it existed in the deep, forgotten, past before recorded time, before Genesis, before memory. Maybe Atlantis was never lost. Maybe it was erased. Let's rewind. It's 360 BCE, and Plato, the philosopher whose name still echoes through lecture halls and Reddit threads alike, is writing two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. These aren't dry philosophical treatises. They're mythological, allegorious, speculative cosmologies, dressed in mythic robes. And in the middle of all this cosmic theory, Plato drops a bomb. A vast empire, beautiful and terrifying, technologically advanced, ruled from a central island, surrounded by concentric rings of land and water. With a fleet and army so powerful, they challenged the entire Mediterranean only to vanish in a single cataclysmic night of earthquakes and floods. Plato claims this is no myth. He says the story comes from Egypt, passed down through priests and relayed to Solon, the great Athenian lawmaker, who then brought it home. According to Plato, this tale dates back some 9,000 years before his time. That's 11,000 years ago. You heard that right. He places Atlantis not just before Greece or Sumer or Egypt, but before civilization as we know it, before the Great Pyramids, before agriculture, before writing, before anything archaeologists are comfortable with. In fact, that puts Atlantis smack in the middle of the last ice age. So, what if he wasn't exaggerating? Let's be honest, Plato had no way of knowing what the world looked like 11,000 years ago, but we do. And it's weird. That era, the late Pleistocene, was a strange intermission in Earth's climate drama. Ice sheets blanketed much of North America and Europe. Sea levels were 300 feet lower than today. Vast areas of land now underwater were habitable, coastal plains, land bridges, inland seas. It was a world where a seafaring, technologically sophisticated people could have lived, traded, even dominated, and then been completely obliterated by rising seas, shifting plates, or cosmic impacts. And here's where things start to spiral. Because Atlantis isn't just a Platonic parable anymore. It's a Rosetta Stone for every forgotten civilization theory you've ever heard. A gravitational point where pseudo-history, ancient aliens, lost continents, and geological cataclysm all meet for coffee. And suddenly, we're not talking about just one lost city. We're talking about a forgotten chapter of Earthen, entire epoch buried beneath myth and mud. Modern theorists like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson argue that Plato's timeline wasn't wrong, it was prophetic. They suggest the end of Atlantis corresponds with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a theory proposing that a comet or fragments of one slammed into the Earth around 10,800 BCE, triggering rapid climate change, floods, and mass extinctions. It's speculative, controversial, hotly debated. But if they're right, then maybe the legend of Atlantis is a cultural fossil, a story passed down through thousands of years, distorted by time but rooted in a real catastrophe. Something happened. And maybe, just maybe, the Atlanteans weren't our ancestors. Maybe they were a different branch, something parallel, something older, something forgotten on purpose. And then there's the architecture. Throughout the world, we find structures that seem to defy the known capabilities of ancient cultures. Massive polygonal stones fitted so precisely you can't slip a razor blade between them. Cyclopean masonry in Peru. Submerged ruins off the coast of India. The Yonaguni Monument in Japan. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas. These places don't say Atlantis on them, but they whisper, they suggest, they hint at a global civilization, or at least a network of knowledge, that predates our accepted timelines. And if that's the case, then Plato might have been less philosopher, more whistleblower. And yet, even this isn't the deepest cut. Because once you accept the idea that Atlantis might have existed before the global flood, myths before the Younger Dryas then, the flood itself becomes something more than punishment. It becomes erasure, an extinction-level clean slate, a reset button. And here's where it gets mythic. In cultures all over the world, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, there are flood stories, almost identical. A golden age, a fall, a deluge. It's not just Noah's Ark, it's Utnapishtim, Manu, Deucalion, Coxcox, Nuu, and more. Different names, same pattern. A great civilization brought low, a divine judgment, a world washed clean. Some say coincidence, others say shared human psychology, but some whisper a different story. What if these tales are echoes of Atlantis? Not just Atlantis as a city, but as a symbol of the before, the pre-moon, the pre-time. Because here's where things get really strange. There are myth-steep, esoteric ones that claim the moon itself wasn't always there. That in a time long, long ago, humanity lived under a different sky, a darker sky, with no tides, no eclipses, no werewolves. Aristotle once mentioned people who remember a time before the moon. The Arcadians, he said, were so ancient they lived in a pre-lunar world. The Zulus speak of a time before the moon. So do some Native American and Maori myths? Of course, this isn't astronomy. The moon is 4.5 billion years old. It's not going anywhere. But myths are metaphors, and metaphors are clues. What if the moon is a symbol? What if it's a stand-in for the modern world? For the celestial order that followed catastrophe? For the reset? In that sense, Atlantis wasn't just before the moon. It was before us. Before the world we know. Before the sky we understand. A civilization that reached up, touched the stars, and was annihilated. Not just by water, but by time, by silence, by deliberate forgetting. And maybe that's the point. Because the danger of Atlantis isn't just that it might have existed. The danger is what it implies. That everything we know, everything we build, can be wiped away. That our gods, our science, our cities, our memories, are all sandcastles before the tide. And the tide always comes. And yet, the myth survives, a ghost in the machine, a sunken memory that keeps resurfacing. And every time it does, we peer over the edge and wonder, what else was down there? What other names have we lost? Which brings us to another sunken story. not from Plato, but from 19th century mystics. A continent even older than Atlantis. Vast, silent, swallowed by time. They called it Mu. And it makes Atlantis look like a starter myth. Mu, Lemuria. In the great cosmic joke that is human history, Atlantis was just the appetizer. Because if Atlantis was the world's favorite lost continent, Mu was its fever dream, its trippier, more delusional cousin. The kind of myth you get when Victorian colonizers, spiritualists, and science-fictional mystics all decide to collaborate on world-building while sipping absinthe and ignoring geology. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're going way back. The idea of Mu begins not with archaeologists or even mystics, but with a missionary. In 1864, a French priest named Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg was combing through a colonial-era Spanish transcript of the Maya codices. These were sacred texts, mostly destroyed during the Conquestone, of which mentioned something called Land of Mu. Brasseur, lacking both the linguistic accuracy and the patience of a trained Mayanist, decided this Mu must be the name of a lost continent in the Pacific. It wasn't, but that didn't stop the myth from metastasizing. Enter Augustus Le Plongeon, a photographer and amateur archaeologist who took Brasseur's Mu, injected it with some Atlantis sauce, and declared that the Mayan civilization was a colony of this sunken motherland. Le Plongeon claimed Mu was the original cradle of civilization, ruled by Queen Mu and her husband Prince Ko. Their tragic love story, naturally, ended with betrayal, murder, and cataclysmic destruction. This was Victorian science fiction cosplay masquerading as history, but it hit a nerve. And within decades, Mu would morph from speculative myth to full-blown cosmic legend. But not alone. Across the ocean, a similar legend was bubbling up this time in the Indian Ocean. The name was Lemuria. The origins? Way nerdier. In the mid-1800s, zoologists noticed something odd. Lemur fossils were found in Madagascar and India, but not in Africa or the Middle East. To explain this, British naturalist Philip Sclater proposed the existence of a now-lost landmass Lemuria that once connected these regions, allowing lemurs to migrate. It was a throwaway theory, a placeholder, a way to account for biology before plate tectonics existed. But the Theosophista, they loved it. Theosophy was a spiritualist movement founded by Helena Blavatsky in the late 19th century. It mixed Eastern mysticism, Western esoterica, and whatever ancient-sounding mythology could be reverse-engineered from Sanskrit words. Lemuria, to them, wasn't a place for primates, it was the homeland of the Lemurians, a giant, psychic, androgynous root race that lived millions of years ago. According to Blavatsky, Lemurians reproduced by laying eggs. Some had 4 arms, some had eyes on the backs of their heads. Others were hermaphroditic adepts capable of astral projection and telepathic communion with the cosmos. It sounds bonkers because it is. But these stories weren't told as fiction. They were sacred history. And in theosophical lore, the Lemurians were only one of 7 root races' successive phases of human evolution, both physical and spiritual, leading toward ultimate ascension. Atlantis, by this account, came later fallen descendants of Lemuria, who succumbed to ego, war, and misused crystal technology. And here's the punchline. The Lemurians, they said, lived before the moon appeared in our sky. Not metaphorically, literally. In their cosmology, the moon was a former planetary body perhaps, a fragment of an earlier Earth system that hadn't always been in orbit. Its arrival marked a transition, a shift in vibration, a kind of cosmic puberty that ended the golden age of Lemuria and triggered its eventual destruction. Modern science, of course, laughs this off. The moon formed about 4.5 billion years ago, likely from a Mars-sized object slamming into the proto-Earth. There were no psychic androgynes back then, only molten rock and sterile oceans. But facts were never the point. Mu and Lemuria aren't scientific hypotheses, they're psychological architecture, collective dreams. Deep myths that emerged in the 19th century not because of fossils or inscriptions, but because the modern world was losing its soul. As colonialism plundered the globe, as Darwinian evolution stripped the divine from biology, and as industrialization paved over mystery with soot and steel, people began to ache for an earlier age, a purer world. A mythic past where humanity was united, wise, and close to the stars. That's what Mu was, a memory of paradise before the fall. And paradise, of course, always drowns. In the myths, Mu doesn't explode. It sinks, slowly, tragically. Its once proud cities swallowed by the Pacific, its priest kings weeping as the temples vanish beneath the waves. Sometimes the story says it was a war, other times a misuse of spiritual power, a sun flare, a pole shift, a comet. Always, though, it's the same theme: hubris, the great sin, the fall from grace. The Lemurians flew too close to the divine, and the god saw the universe wipe the slate clean. Which brings us to a deeply uncomfortable question. Why do we keep inventing civilizations that lived before the moon? Why is there this recurring narrative across cultures, continents, and centuries that something vast, enlightened, and ancient once existed, only to be swallowed by water, time, and cosmic reordering? Maybe it's guilt. Maybe we suspect that civilization isn't a linear climb, but a cycle, that we're not the first, that we're just another Atlantis, another Lemuria, another temporary flare in the long night of geological time. Or maybe it's memory. Some researchers suggest that myths of sunken continents are distorted memories of real events: post-glacial sea level rise, the flooding of Sunda and Doggerland, the Black Sea deluge. As waters rose, entire coastal societies would have vanished slowly in geological terms, but apocalyptically fast to the people living there. Over generations, those memories mutate. A shoreline becomes a kingdom. A flood becomes divine judgment. An island becomes Mu. But what if that memory runs even deeper? Let's get weird. There are those who believe that Mu wasn't just a mythic continent, it was a phase of consciousness, an age in which humanity or whatever preceded existed in harmony with the planet, the cosmos, and each other. A time before duality, before ego, before language. A time when the moon hadn't yet fallen into orbit, when the sky was different, when Earth vibrated at a different frequency, when gravity, time, and memory were not what they are now. To them, the moon is a symbol of separation, of illusion, of reflection and fragmentation. Its arrival marks the beginning of this world, the world of division, death, and forgetting. In this telling, Mu wasn't just a place, it was a state of being. And its fall was our fall. There's no evidence for this, of course, but evidence was never the currency here. These myths persist not because they're provable, but because they're powerful. They answer something that science doesn't, not what happened, but what did we lose? And they give shape to a fear that haunts every civilization, that our story is not unique, that our rise is temporary, that beneath the ocean soar and the silence between epochs ere buried entire histories will never recover. And maybe that's what the moon represents. A bright, beautiful void, always watching, always silent. A reminder that something is missing, something we once had, something we once were. And if Mu was the dream, then what came before it was the nightmare. Because not all pre-moon civilizations were wise, gentle, or spiritually advanced. Some, legend says, were reptilian, ancient, cold-blooded gods who ruled before humanity even walked upright. You might know them by another name. The Silurians. If your mind's already spiraling from Atlantis and Mu, just wait, we're barely through the first layer. Make sure you subscribe to keep digging deeper into the myths time tried to erase. And let's anchor this moment in reality. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. We're building our own global map of memory. The Silurians, they woke up angry. Not because they'd been mistreated, enslaved, or even hunted to extinction. No, the Silurians were pissed because we humans had the audacity to evolve, build cities, and claim dominion over a world they once ruled. A world they had carefully abandoned, slumbering beneath its crust in vast hibernation chambers, waiting for the climate to stabilize and the stars to realign. But when they emerged from their deep sleep millions of years later, what did they find? Us, polluting the sky, chopping down the forests, dropping nukes, believing we were the first and only children of Earth. The Silurians are a creation of science fiction. Specifically, they debuted in 1970 on the British television show Doctor Who. Cold-blooded, humanoid reptiles, hyper-advanced, native to Earth, not alien invaders, but Earth's original apex species. It was a clever twist. What if humans weren't the first intelligent civilization on this planet? What if we were just squatters, living in the ruins of an older, grander world? But here's the thing. The story caught on because it scratched an itch. A deep, uncomfortable itch in the collective brain. The idea that buried beneath the layers of sediment, fossil, and myth is another chapter of Earth's historia, and chapter erased not by accident, but by design. Let's play this out. Imagine a civilization that arose not tens of thousands of years ago, but tens of millions. The Silurian Hypothesis, a real thought experiment proposed by scientists, asks, if an industrial civilization had existed millions of years before humans, would we even be able to detect it? Spoiler, maybe not. Over geological time, almost everything degrades. Cities crumble, metal corrodes, plastics break down, and sediment buries the evidence. The crust of the Earth is constantly being recycled. After just a few million years, the only lingering traces might be isotopic anomalies in the fossil record, unexplained shifts in carbon levels, or subtle geochemical fingerprints indistinguishable from natural events. So, if the Silurians or something like them had once risen, expanded, burned fossil fuels, fought wars, built machines, and then fallen, we might never know. And that possibility is intoxicating. Because the idea of ancient reptilian overlords is more than just pulp sci-fi. It speaks to something primal. Reptiles are our evolutionary cousins, older, colder, and more alien in every way. They ruled the Earth for over 150 million years. Dinosaurs were the rock stars, but behind the scenes, a quieter intelligence could have evolved. Not giant thunder lizards, but smaller, smarter predators. Think velociraptors, those turkey-sized, sickle-clawed nightmare birds pushed just a little further down the evolutionary track. Give them a few million more years. Give them fire, language, tools, cities. And then give them reason to vanish. Mass extinction events are Earth's punctuation marks. They end eras and clear the board. The Permian Triassic, the Triassic Jurassic, the Cretaceous Paleogene. Every few tens of millions of years, something hits reset. What if one of those resets wasn't caused by a random asteroid, but by something else? Something internal. A war, a misused technology, a power source they couldn't control, a moral collapse so catastrophic that even their architecture was consumed by it. And what if, knowing what they'd done, they chose to disappear? To bury themselves, literally, into the Earth. The Silurians of Doctor Who were frozen in suspended animation, waiting for the atmosphere to become safe again. But maybe the real Silurians never woke up. Maybe they didn't want to. Maybe their failure was so absolute, their shame so immense, that they sealed their history away forever and left us to start over. It's not such a stretch. After all, the fossil record is woefully incomplete. We have fragments, bones, teeth, impressions. The odds of a full skeleton surviving, being fossilized, not destroyed by time or erosion, and then actually being discovered? Astronomical. So if a civilization lasted just a few 100,000 years long enough to bloom, shine, and fall, its physical remains might be as rare as a lottery ticket in a hurricane. And if it lived mostly in coastal regions like we do, those remains would now be deep underwater, thanks to eons of shifting sea levels. Which brings us to the chilling symmetry. The Silurians weren't invaders. They were us. They were Earth's first children, first scientists, first victims of their own brilliance. And in the darkest telling of the myth, they didn't die out. They didn't vanish. They went underground. Not in some metaphorical sense. Literally. Into the caverns, into the magma tunnels, into the deep. They built sanctuaries, bunkers, repositories of knowledge, and they waited. Some versions of the legend claim they still wait, monitoring us, judging us, watching as we repeat their mistakes, as we poison the seas, as we fracture the climate, as we split the atom and hack the gene and chase profits over principles, watching as we build towers of steel and glass on the bones of forgotten gods. There's a mythological echo here, a parallel in ancient texts. The Nagas of Hindu and Buddhist lore, serpentine beings of great power who live underground, guarding secrets and treasures. The serpent people of Mesoamerican myths. The reptilian Anunnaki of conspiracy lore. Cold-blooded gods, ancient knowledge, hidden agendas, and even in modern pop culture, the motif returns. In comic books, in television shows, in fringe theories and late-night radio broadcasts, reptilian overlords, secret rulers, eyes like slits. Why? Because deep down, we're afraid of what came before, afraid of what we buried, afraid of what remembers us. And here's the most unsettling idea of all. What if the Silurians or their memory were not just erased by time, but made to be forgotten? What if forgetting was part of the design? Maybe memory itself is fragile. Maybe it resets, like a hard drive. Maybe Earth's history is cyclical not by accident, but by design. Maybe some planetary mechanism, some cosmic protocol ensures that when a civilization goes too far, it ends. Not just physically, but narratively. The slate wiped clean. The next species starts from scratch. No guidance, no inheritance, just fossils, myths, and ruins that no one can quite explain. The Silurians aren't just a sci-fi concept. They're an archetype, a metaphor for every lost chapter, every dark age, every whisper of what came before. And if they're real, if even a fraction of the legend holds truth, then we're not the first. We're not the pinnacle. We're the rebound, the second draft. And we're already making the same mistakes. But even the Silurians weren't the first. According to some, they were preceded by something even more profound. Not a race. Not a species. A planet. A whole world that no longer exists. A ghost world that might have collided with the Earth itself. They call it Theia. And its people? The Theans. Elder things. Before the pyramids, before the stars had settled into their constellations, before the word civilization had any meaning at all, there were the elder things. And they did not come from Earth. They fell here, or landed, or maybe they were already here, long before anything we'd call life began to crawl from the sea. In the fevered vision of H.P. Lovecraft, these beings were not gods, not devils, not metaphors. They were scientists, colonizers from the void, arriving on the infant planet billions of years ago, ready to shape it. They were tall, barrel-shaped entities, with 5 ridged limbs ending in claw-like hands, starfish-shaped heads ringed with eyes, wings that weren't wings, and an air of antiquity that defied all attempts at categorization. Organic, yes. Artificial, maybe. Alive, undeniably. Dead, not exactly. Lovecraft called them the Old Ones, but Elder Things was the name that stuck. They built the first cities on Earth, not in Mesopotamia or Egypt, but in Antarctica, when it was still lush and tropical. Vast, stone-black geometries so alien they warped human minds. They sculpted the world's first art, wrote the first languages whorled and spined and completely incomprehensible. They didn't worship, they experimented. They didn't dream, they calculated. And they didn't evolve, they engineered. Life on Earth? According to their legend, they made it. Not intentionally, not as a gift, but as an experiment gone sideways, a biological tool that escaped the lab. Maybe even humanity itself, just a byproduct, an accidental offshoot of their experiments with cellular matrices. We are, in this telling, not children of God. We are the lab rats of something much older, and much more disinterested. Because the Elder Things weren't malicious, not in the way we understand. They weren't cruel, they weren't even evil, they simply didn't care. To them, humanity was bacteria, intriguing, in the way mold might be to a bored biologist. Their cities stretched across the poles, subterranean, subglacial, immune to time. Long after they retreated from the surface world, their structures remained monolithic, cryptic, alive with residual energy, their stories carved into basalt, their knowledge encrypted in non-Euclidean angles. And then they vanished. Or rather, they were driven away. Not by humans, not by time, by something worse. The Elder Things, we're told, lost control of their creations. Chief among them were the Shoggoth's protoplasmic, shape-shifting horrors designed to serve, to build, to obey. But over time, they rebelled. A slave revolt of roiling matter and stolen thought. The Elder Things fought back, barely won, lost ground, fell into hiding, fled the world they once ruled. The Shoggoths, meanwhile, learned and waited. In this mythos, Antarctica becomes more than a wasteland, it becomes the tomb of gods, or worse, a prison, a vault, a sealed archive of truths too old and too terrible to survive exposure. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness isn't just fiction. It's revelation. It's a decoding of what came before history, before time, before the moon. Because here's the unsettling possibility. What if the Elder Things weren't just monsters in a horror story? What if they were a memory? Not Lovecraft's memory or memory. A cultural residue. A fragmented recollection of some impossibly ancient truth. Because they fit the pattern. A civilization from before the dawn of man. Highly advanced. Non-human. Cosmic. Erased. And still present. Whispers of them echo in other cultures, other myths. The Apkallu of Sumerfish men, who brought civilization from the sea. The Namo of the Dogon amphibious beings who descended from the stars. The Owanes of Babylon's scholarly, semi-aquatic deities. In every case, knowledge, bringers, teachers, architects, and always other. It gets deeper. If you believe the more esoteric interpretations, the Elder Things didn't just arrive on Earth, they shaped it. Literally. Some say they terraformed the early planet, balanced its magnetic fields, seeded its biomes, tilted its axis, engineered its orbit. And the moon? Theories diverge. Some say the Elder Things arrived before the moon and watched it be born from the chaos of the Theia impact calculating, observing, perhaps even intervening to stabilize the orbit. Others say the moon itself is one of their constructs, a hollowed-out station, a stabilizer, a failsafe, a lighthouse for lost gods. And if that's true, if the moon is theirs, then we've never really left their domain. Not in 4.5 billion years. We live under the eye of the architects. And what happens when the architects return? Because in Lovecraft's narrative, the elder things aren't dead. They're dormant, preserved in the ice, waiting. Some frozen, some sealed in vaults, some reduced to spores, to data, to quantum signatures. It's not death, it's maintenance mode. And when the time is right, when the planet is warm again, or aligned just so, or when our own meddling finally trips the right lever, they will wake, and we will see what before really means. But let's shift the frame. Even if Lovecraft's specifics are fictional, the template isn't. The idea of a pre-human civilization that brought knowledge, left behind ruins, and then vanished, leaving behind a trace of terror, of awaits everywhere. Why do we keep inventing these beings? Because they serve a narrative. They explain the unexplainable. They put a face many-eyed, tentacled in our deepest fear, that we are not the first, that we live in a haunted house. And sometimes, the haunting is structural. Non-Euclidean geometry, strange angles, dream languages. It's the aesthetic of a civilization whose perception of reality was incompatible with ours. Imagine trying to decode a language that thinks in 4 dimensions. Imagine architecture built for minds that don't die. Imagine a civilization that didn't forget. That's what makes the Elder Things different from Atlantis, or Mu, or even Thea. They didn't fall because of hubris. They didn't vanish in a flood. They simply stepped aside, retreated, waited. And they left behind a world custom-made for forgetting. We dig in the ice and find nothing. We scan the seafloor and see only rock. Because they designed it that way. And if the Elder Things are still out there under the poles, behind the stars, encoded in the moon's cold orbit, then what else did they know? What did they fear? Because even they had enemies. Even the Elder Things had nightmares. And the next civilization on our list may be one of them. A mythic race from the edge of the world. Pre-Olympian. Post-reality. The keepers of frozen light. They called them Hyperboreans. Hyperborea. There is a silence in the north that's older than ice. A silence that isn't just cold, it's sacred, unbroken, timeless. That's where the Hyperboreans lived. Not in the snow-blanketed forests of Siberia, not in the glacier-split fjords of Scandinavia, but far beyond, past the edge of the maps, past the limits of human endurance. A place where the sun never sets and the wind speaks in riddles. Hyperborea. Literally, beyond the north wind. According to the Greeks, it was paradise. A land untouched by time. No disease, no war, no hunger. Just peace, beauty, and radiant sun. The Hyperboreans didn't toil. They didn't age. They lived in harmony with nature, with each other, with the gods. And the gods came often. Apollo, in particular, was said to visit Hyperborea every 19 years, retreating from the corrupt noise of the world to bask in the purity of this Arctic Eden. It was his true home, some said. Delphi might have been his temple, but Hyperborea was his heart. It's easy to dismiss Hyperborea as poetic nonsense, another utopia invented by ancient minds yearning for lost innocence, an Arctic Atlantis designed not for credibility but for catharsis. But there's something older here. Because Hyperborea wasn't just a pretty myth, it was a cosmic one. A myth that positioned itself not in history, but in prehistory. Not just before civilization, but before humanity. And the more you peel back the layers, the stranger it gets. The Hyperboreans weren't just human idealizations, they were something else. Tall, luminous, radiant with solar energy. In some versions, they were sexless. In others, they reproduced through parthenogenesis, virgin birth, self-cloning. They didn't die, they transcended, ascended into pure light, dissolved into the aurora borealis. In later esoteric traditions, especially those flirted with by theosophists and fringe occult historians, Hyperborea becomes more than a myth. It becomes the first civilization, the cradle of all later cultures, and crucially it was pre-lunar. In these traditions, the moon is seen not just as a physical object, but as a dividing line. Before the moon, purity, unity, spiritual harmony. After the moon, duality, decay, death, the fall into time. And the Hyperboreans? They were the last to live before the moon appeared, or the last to remember what came before. In this cosmology, the moon is a veil, a scar, a prison. It marks the end of one cosmic age and the beginning of another. The Hyperboreans, then, weren't just early humans, they were remnants. Survivors of a higher reality that ended when the moon took its place in the sky. Let's dig deeper. According to Diodorus Siculus, a 1st century BCE historian, Hyperborea was a real place. He described it as an island of no small size in the far north, where the stars never set, and life was one long eternal spring. That sounds absurd until you realize he might be describing a polar environment during the Holocene thermal maximum, when parts of the Arctic were lush, green, and bizarrely temperate. Imagine this. Around 10,000 years ago, in the warming world after the last ice age, an isolated population in the Arctic reaches a strange evolutionary harmony. Long days, fertile land, no predators, no stressors. They develop culture not in the way we think of it, with conquest and cities, but through resonance, music, meditation, astronomical tracking. They become not conquerors, but observers, watchers of the sky, listeners to the Earth's breath. And then something changes. The moon appears. Not physically, it had always been there, but visibly, suddenly, cataclysmically. Some traditions say the moon fell into orbit, others that it was pulled into being. In either case, the appearance of the moon is tied to a rupture in cosmic order. Some say it marks the beginning of death, of menstruation, of tides and time and entropy. The moon brings memory, pain, ego. The clean lines of Hyperborean consciousness begin to blur. They fragment. They fall. And the people? They vanish. Not through flood or fire. Through fading. Through withdrawal. Hyperborea doesn't sink, it lifts. It steps out of phase, ascends, turns invisible to the human timeline. And what's left? Echoes. Fragments. Legends of white gods who came from the north. Civilizers with long limbs and glowing eyes. Everywhere from the Andes to the Himalayas to the Nile Valley, ancient cultures speak of teachers from the far north who brought knowledge, calendar systems, star maps. Coincidence? Maybe. But the pattern holds. Hyperborea becomes the ghost mother of civilizations. Not a place, but a frequency. A signal embedded in myth, waiting to be decrypted. Even the name lingers. The Nazis chased it. So did Blavatsky. So do New Agers, conspiracy theorists, esoteric Christians, and forgotten corners of Reddit. They all whisper the same thing. That Hyperborea was real. That it was better. And that it was erased. But not by time. By design. The arrival of the moon weather, literal or metaphorical, wasn't just a celestial event. It was a lockdown, a quarantine, a reboot. The luminous purity of Hyperborea had to be hidden. Memory had to be fragmented. History had to start from zero. And we've been chasing it ever since. In ruins, in myths, in dreams. But here's the twist. What if the Hyperboreans never left? What if they didn't fade, or die, or transcend but waited, buried beneath the ice, like the elder things? or hidden in the magnetic anomalies of the poles, or encoded in our DNA dormant, recessive, waiting for the signal. Because in some versions of the myth, the return of Hyperborea isn't just possible, it's inevitable. When the ice melts, when the stars align, when the moon's spell finally breaks, they will come back. Not as saviors, not as gods, but as memory, as the part of ourselves we forgot to remember. And if that sounds insane good, because now you're in the right state of mind to meet the next civilization. They weren't mythical. They weren't metaphysical. They were believers, and they claimed to speak with the dead. They called them Lemurians. There's a peculiar moment in history when science fiction, colonial pseudoscience, and full-throttle spiritualism all collided, and from the wreckage rose the Lemurians. Not the scientific Lemuria. That idea that lemurs on Madagascar and India hinted at a lost land bridge was already halfway buried by the time the 20th century rolled in. No, these Lemurians were something else. They weren't invented by geologists. They were summoned by mystics, mediums, clairvoyants, and the growing cult of spiritual progress that swept through the Western world during the 1800s like a cosmic wildfire. They came bearing messages, not in books or scrolls, but in vibrations, through seances, through astral travel, through dreams. Their story wasn't told in carbon dating or fossil strata but in revelation. According to their believers, the Lemurians were a race that lived long before Atlantis, on a continent that spanned what is now the Pacific and Indian Oceans. It stretched from Madagascar to California, through Sri Lanka, Polynesia, Easter Island, and beyond. And these weren't your standard prehistoric tribespeople. The Lemurians were perfect, tall, serene, spiritually evolved, capable of telepathy, teleportation, and other gifts that made early 20th century humans look like hairless monkeys banging rocks together. They didn't speak. They vibrated. They didn't walk. They glided. They didn't pray. They remembered. And they remembered what came before the moon. According to their gospel, the appearance of the moon marked a fall from Gracia, lowering of Earth's vibrational field. Before the moon, life was radiant, souls incarnated freely. The veil between spirit and matter was thin, translucent, practically optional. But the moon hardened the world. It introduced karma, death, cycles. It shackled consciousness to biology, made it forgetful, made it mortal. The Lemurians, the story goes, tried to warn us. They preserved their wisdom in crystals, in caves, in memory lines etched into the Earth's magnetic grid. They built power centers, Lemurian nodes that still resonate in places like Mount Shasta, the Himalayas, Uluru, Easter Island. Yes, Mount Shasta. Let's go there for a minute. In the lore, Mount Shasta in Northern California is the last known refuge of the Lemurians, a hidden city beneath its snowy peak Telos. An underground sanctuary sealed from time, where these enlightened beings still live, invisible, waiting, occasionally surfacing to guide a chosen few. You know, the usual. They wear white robes, emit soft auras, glide across snow without footprints. They're what you'd get if you mixed elves, avatars, and the vibe of a spa playlist into one glowing humanoid. And thousands believe in them. They come to Mount Shasta on pilgrimage, meditate in caves, channel messages, sell quartz-infused water for $45 a bottle. Entire subcultures have been built around contact with Lemurian energy. But if you strip away the New Age gloss, what you find is an old impulse. The Lemurians aren't just a fantasy, they're an apology. An apology for modernity. For everything we've lost in the pursuit of progress. They represent the idealized, past peaceful, wise, in tune with nature, untouched by the corrosive machinery of empire, capitalism, and ego. They are the ancestors we wish we had. And here's the kicker. their continents sank. Of course it did. Like Atlantis, like Mu, like every civilization we romanticize and erase. The Lemurians, we are told, foresaw the coming disaster and either ascended, retreated underground, or chose to perish in harmony with the Earth's cycles rather than flee. It wasn't just a flood. It was a choice. Because they weren't afraid of death. They understood it. They knew consciousness doesn't end, it migrates, reincarnates, returns. Some say the Lemurians became us. That modern humanity is the result of their spiritual descent into matter, that our bones carry their memory. That our DNA is a compressed archive of Lemurian knowledge, waiting to be unlocked by frequency, intention, or maybe just the right playlist. Others say they never left. That they still operate from higher dimensions, whispering ideas into the minds of artists, scientists, rebels. That every great leap of intuition, compassion, or innovation is a Lemurian nudge. And always the moon is watching. In Lemurian cosmology, the moon isn't just a rock. It's a symbol of forgetting, a metaphysical amnesia engine. The more we live under it, the more we forget who we were. And yet, that forgetting is part of the plan. The Lemurians teach that we chose to forget so we could rediscover. That Earth is a school, and Lemuria was the preschool. Idyllic, innocent, sheltered. Now we're in middle school. Awkward, hormonal, violent, but slowly, painfully learning. And when we graduate, they'll be waiting. But here's the darker possibility. What if the Lemurians weren't as perfect as they claim? What if their civilization ended not in serene transcendence but in arrogance? In the same hubris that sank Atlantis? In the same pattern we always repeat? Some tellings of the myth suggest the Lemurians split into factions. One part remained pure, spiritually aligned. The other pursued power, control, the manipulation of life, energy. And that second group became corrupted. Sound familiar? It's the same duality that shows up in every fallen civilization story. And maybe that's the point. Maybe these myths aren't about ancient continents at all. Maybe they're about us. About the endless war between ego and soul, between memory and forgetting, between the moon and the sun. The Lemurians were the sun. We are the moon. And someday, the two will reunite. But not yet. Because before we can reclaim our radiant past, we have to pass through the shadow, through the blood and ice and bone of more ancient things, through the primordial violence of beings who weren't spirit guides or cosmic healers. They were giants. They were monsters. They were the first. And in the frozen echoes of their legend, we meet them now. Ymir's folk, 7 layers deepened, we've barely scratched the crust. If you've made it this far, you're exactly who this channel was built for. Subscribe to stay aligned as we dive even further. And now, quick check-in. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Type it in the comments. Let's see who's awake and who's remembering. Ymir's folk. Before the world there was ice, and in that ice there was a body, vast, primeval, not dead, because death hadn't been invented yet, not alive, because life wasn't ready, just there. His name was Ymir. In Norse myth, he's the first being, the cosmic ancestor, born from the collision of fire and ice in the yawning void of Ginnungagapa, place without shape, without time, a pre-universe. A place so raw that the concepts of birth, death, creation, and destruction hadn't yet diverged. Only chaos, only becoming. And Ymir? He was the becoming. He sweated children from his armpits, giants, Jötnar, ancestors of frost and storm and bone. He fed on the milk of the great cow Audhumla, who licked the salty rime of ice until a man named Buri emerged, Bori fathered Bor, Bor fathered Odin, and Odin along with his brother skilled Ymir. Cut him down, dismembered him, turned his flesh into the earth, his blood into the oceans, his bones into mountains, his skull became the sky, his brain, the clouds, his eyebrows, the barrier around Midgard. That's right. The world we walk on? It's a corpse. A god corpse. A titangent body. The dismembered anatomy of the first. So who were Ymir's folk? They weren't gods. They weren't even exactly giants. They were pre-gods, proto-beings, the raw material from which everything else was made. And in the original stories, they weren't evil or good, they were older. Older than order. Older than morality. They didn't build cities. They were the cities. Their spines became mountain ranges. Their hair became forests. Their blood, still warm, flows as rivers. To walk the earth is to walk through a butchered mythology. Every breath you take is air pushed through a ribcage that once roared. The ground beneath you was once a shoulder blade. The moonlight on your skin, it reflects off a sky made from skull fragments. Ymir's folk aren't dead, they're transfigured. And in some darker versions of the myth, they're not done yet. The Jotnarte frost giants, who survived Odin's genocidery, treated to the edges of reality. They brood in Jotunheim, the land beyond comprehension, not just physically distant, but conceptually, outside time, outside law. They plot. Not revenge exactly. That would be too human, more like a correction, the restoration of primordial chaos, a return to the unshaped world, because order, to them, is a cage. Odin and his kin shaped the world from Ymir's bones, but shaping is violence, imposing symmetry where none belongs. The folk of Ymir didn't consent to being architecture, and their memory lingers. It pulses, it dreams, and it leaks. Through fault lines, through volcanoes, through dreams and madness, and the things that crawl out of the deep with too many eyes and no names. That's the fear, isn't it? That we're not on top of a world. We're inside a body, a holy, violated body. And the act of living, walking, building, diggingus, desecration, the Norse weren't alone in this. Across the ancient world, we see echoes of the titangent flesh world builder myth. The Aztecs believed the gods had to sacrifice themselves to create the sun and moon. The Chinese Pangu myth tells of a giant who died and became the elements. The Vedic Purusha was dismembered to form the universe. The pattern is clear. Before time, a giant. After time, a slaughter. And in between, us. But Ymir's folk aren't just myth. In the Norse cosmology, they were before the gods, before the moon, which means they might remember the world as it was, before cycles, before calendars, before lunar tides and menstrual rhythms and lunacy. They existed in a time without seasons, just endless cold, eternal frost, a silence you could drown in. And maybe, just maybe, they resented what came after. Because here's the unspoken horror. Ymir didn't die. He was broken. His consciousness scattered, fragmented, woven into the weave of reality. Which means it's still there, behind the wind, in the groan of glaciers, in the stillness that falls before a blizzard. When you stand alone in the snow and feel a presence too big to be named, too quiet to be heard, that's Ymir. That's the folk. And some say they want their body back. The Rokkr gods of Norse myth like Surtur, Fenrir, and Jörmungandr aren't just villains. They're corrective agents. Beasts that rise at Ragnarok to undo the world. To pull the bones back into shape. To unmake the gods. To wake the sleeper. Ymir isn't dead. He's dreaming. And in that dream, the moon never rose. The world was white, cold, pure, uncarved. A realm where time didn't tick and stars didn't spin. That's what the folk of Ymir want. Not revenge. Restoration. The erasure of the wound called creation. And maybe, just maybe, they still walk. In caves. In frozen tombs. In the DNA of giants who vanish from folklore but refuse to leave our stories. Because the truth is, we can't forget them. We dream of giants. We paint them, write them, fear them, idolize them. Not because they're myth, but because they're memory. The memory of before the moon rose. Before Odin's blade fell. Before the bones of the world were rearranged. Ymir's folk were the last to see the earth unshaped. But they weren't alone, because in the west, on a mist-cloaked island soaked in green fire, another race of primordial beings remembered the same silence. Not giants, but gods. Or maybe refugees. The Tuatha de Danan. Tuatha de Danan. Before the druids whispered to trees, before the Celts painted their faces and went to war, before Stonehenge was aligned with the solstice sun, there were the Tuatha de Danan. They arrived in mist, not metaphorical mist literal, swirling otherworldly fog, the kind that rolls in before a revelation, or a disappearance. The myths say they came in ships that floated not on water, but in air, that they landed on the green bones of Ireland like gods stepping down from Olympus. Only they weren't gods, exactly. And they weren't human, not entirely. They were something else. Tall, radiant, armored in strange metals, masters of science and magic so advanced the locals couldn't tell the difference. They brought with them 4 treasure objects of immeasurable power, a sword that never missed, a spear that guaranteed victory, a cauldron that left no one unsatisfied, and a stone that screamed under kings. And then they vanished. That's the story, in its broadest strokes. But underneath the poetry is something rawer, stranger, older than Ireland, older than myth. The Tuatha de Danan are said to have come from the sky. Some accounts place their origin in the northern isles of the world. Others say they came from Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth, somewhere far beyond the veil. But the real esoteric threads tie them to something even deeper, to the stars, to other worlds, to cosmic cycles so vast they bend the mind. In certain interpretations especially, those buried in the margins of Celtic esotericatha, Tuatha weren't just magical, they were pre-lunar. That's right. In these tellings, they arrived in an era before the moon hung in our sky, or, more accurately, before the moon became what it is now, a stabilizing force, a lunar prison, a gravitational leash. The Tuatha de Danan remembered the sky when it was different, when the constellations told different stories, when Earth vibrated at a higher frequency, before the lunar tides introduced entropy, forgetfulness, decay. They remembered a world of clarity. And then they watched it fall. Because here's where the myth turns. The Tuatha weren't alone. When they arrived, they found Ireland inhabited by the Firbolg and then by the Fomorians. The Firbolg were mortal, earthbound, simple. But the Fomorians? They were something else entirely. Twisted, primordial, seaborn. They represented the forces of chaos, of entropy, of deep oceanic darkness. Cyclopean, diseased, cruel. And the Tuatha fought them, not just with weapons, but with knowledge. Light against dark, order against chaos. It wasn't just a battle, it was a ritual. A reenactment of the cosmic war that had already played out 1,000 times on 1,000 worlds. The Tuatha de Danan were not just refugees or colonizers, they were custodians, attempting to restore balance on a planet that had already tilted toward decay. And they failed. Or maybe they succeeded too well, because after defeating the Fomorians, the Tuatha themselves were conquered. The Milesians arrived, mortal humans from Iberia, and drove the Tuatha underground. Literally, into the Sid, the hollow hills. There, they became the Eos Sith fairy folk, the hidden people, the whisper behind the wind, the glint behind the stone, the footstep in the woods that doesn't echo quite right. But that's not a demotion, that's camouflage. The Tuatha De Danan withdrew from the world. They didn't die, they didn't fade. They stepped sideways, into myth, into dream, into the interdimensional pockets we now call the other world. They became memory, but not our memory. The Earth's memory. Their knowledge, their energy, their frequency, it's still here, embedded in the land, in the ley lines, in the standing stones and the stone circles, in the weird shimmer of twilight when the veil gets thin, and always, always, just behind the moon. Because in many esoteric traditions, the moon is a kind of clock, a mechanism that governs the turning of the ages, and the Tuatha De Danan, we are told, existed in an age before that mechanism took over. In that age, the veil was thin. Mortals and immortals walked side by side. Dreams were shared. Time was non-linear. Memory was complete. Then the moon arrivador changed, or was activated, and the age ended. The veil thickened. Time became history, and the Tuatha stepped out. But not entirely. They still whisper. To poets, to prophets, to the mad. To anyone who still walks the old paths, who still knows which trees bleed light and which rivers remember names. They are the echo of a world that hasn't ended, it's just waiting. Waiting for the next cycle. Because here's the unspoken truth. The Tuatha De Danan are coming back. When? When the moon's clock runs out. When the veil lifts. When humanity finally remembers what it used to know. What it chose to forget. And that's the thread that binds all these civilizations, the sense of interruption, that something was lost, broken, sealed. The Tuatha De Danan didn't just fall. They were paused, like a bookmark in the Earth's story. And when the page turns, they'll be there, with their spear, their cauldron, their stone, and a sky without a moon. But we're not done. Because even the Tuatha had ancestors. Sky beings so old they predate myth itself, entities from the first city-states, architects of humanity's blueprint. They fell from above, and in their language, creation began not with clay or dust, but with data. Their name? Adapa, the Anunnaki. Adapa, Anunnaki. In the beginning, there wasn't Eden. There was Eridu, a windswept settlement on the floodplains of ancient Sumer. Not mythical, not speculative, real. One of the world's first cities, with temples older than the pyramids, older than Babylon, older than God's wrath and rainbows. And in the temple of Eridu lived Adapa. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a god, he was something stranger. A sage, a priest, a prototype. He was human, but not like us. According to Sumerian myth, Adapa was created by Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and mischief. Not born, created. From clay, from code, from something. The texts call him wise, blameless, the model of man. He didn't hunt, he didn't plow. He read stars, spoke to spirits, understood the rhythms of wind and time. And then he broke the sky. Here's how the story goes. One day, while fishing in the Gulf, Adapa is caught in a storm. In his fury, he breaks the wing of the south wind, grounding it for 7 days. The gods are not amused. Anu, the sky god, the boss of bosses, summons him to heaven. This should be the end of Adapa. A mortal standing before the throne of the gods? But it isn't. He goes. He passes the gatekeepers. He's offered food and water of immortality, and he refuses. Why? Because Enki's creator told him to. Told him the food was poison, the water, a trap. And so, Adapithus early man, this genetically modified priest being turns down eternal life and is cast back to earth. He becomes the archetype of the human condition, intelligent, enlightened, loyal but mortal. We were so close. But what if that wasn't just a parable? What if Adapa wasn't a myth? What if he was a memory, the first in a long line of prototypes? And what if Enki wasn't just a god? What if he was an engineer? Because that's where the Anunnaki come in. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the Anunnaki are the great gods, children of Anu, judges, creators, caretakers of civilization. In the myths, they descend from the heavens and bring order, kingship. Language, astronomy, agriculture. In more fringe retellings, the kind whispered in late-night podcasts and translated from half-erased clay tablets, they aren't gods at all. They're visitors. From the stars. From Nibiru. Or from somewhere else, a rogue planet, a hidden dimension, a stable orbit that intersects ours every few thousand years. In these versions, the Anunnaki didn't just teach civilization, they built it. And us. Out of clay, yes, but not ordinary clay, genetic clay. They took early hominids and upgraded them, spliced DNA, inserted consciousness, gave us enough intelligence to farm, build, mine. Because that, allegedly, was the purpose. Gold. That's the conspiracy-layered version anyway. The Anunnaki needed a labor force, so they made one. Efficient, obedient, just smart enough to follow instructions, and just mortal enough to forget who they really were. Adapa was the first glitch. Too perfect. Too aware. He saw the system. And so, he was denied immortality. But not before learning things that would ripple across time. Because Adapa becomes the seed, the father of scribes, prophets, kings, the link between the gods and the clay. And the story doesn't stop there. The Anunnaki vanish. The Sumerians collapse. But the echoes persist. Every ancient culture has a sky-being myth, a knowledge bringer, a forbidden tree moment. Prometheus, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, Thoth. Even in the Bible, Enoch, Noah, the Nephilim, all the same template. A human lifted up, given secrets, then cast down or punished for knowing too much. It's the Adapa pattern, and it's everywhere. So what does this have to do with the moon? Everything. Because in some tellings, the moon wasn't part of Earth's original design. It was added by the Anunnaki as a base, a station, a surveillance platform, or Worse Vault, a cosmic hard drive storing the genetic templates of life on Earth, a failsafe, a backup plan. And when humanity began to wake up, when our DNA started triggering memories, dreams, questions, the moon kicked in. Reset. Wipe. Amnesia. Adapa's choice echoes again. To know or not to know. To eat the fruit of the gods or stay safe in the garden. The moon is the garden wall. And the Anunnaki? They're the gardeners. But are they gone? Or just silent? Some believe they will return. That they do return, cyclically, when Earth reaches certain thresholds. Cataclysm. Awakening. Alignment. In these moments, floods, quakes, revelations, they descend. In craft, in dreams, in rituals disguised as coincidence. They watch the Adapas. The ones who glitch. Who remember. Who reject the programming. And they wonder, will this batch make it? Or does the slate need to be wiped again? But maybe the Anunnaki aren't the creators. Maybe they were intermediaries. Maybe they too served someone or something older. Because in Japan, the whispers don't come from the gods. They come from the soil, from the firelit faces of ceramic spirits with sky-shaped eyes. They are older than the Anunnaki, and in their silence, they tell a story. The story of the Jomon spirits. The Jomon people didn't build pyramids. They didn't carve megaliths, conquer continents, or wage wars in chariots. What they did was wait. For millennia. They lived in forests, on riverbanks, beside oceans, threading their lives through a rhythm older than Empire Salder, even than agriculture. From about 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE, the Jomon culture thrived in what we now call Japan, weaving an unbroken spiral of settlement, ritual, and stillness. And they left behind eyes, not corpses, not hieroglyphs, eyes. They come to us in the form of dogu small clay figurines, humanoid but not quite human. They sit with bulbous heads, wide hips, armor-like torsos. Their eyes are massive, goggle-like, owl-shaped, stargazing. They are watching something we forgot how to see. Scholars say these figures were fertility idols. Others say they were ritual toys, effigies, healing dolls. But that's all guessing. The truth is, nobody really knows what the Dogu were for. But they were important, revered, buried with ceremony, shattered in pieces and carefully left behind, as if killing a god softly, gently, with purpose. And the Jomon? They just kept living for 13,000 years. That's not a typo. To put that into perspective, the entire span of civilization, as we know it from the first Sumerian ziggurat to Tiktokus, maybe 6,000 years. The Jomon doubled that, just by being no empires, no collapse, just time, spiraling slowly, like the corded patterns they pressed into clay. They were not hunter-gatherers, not exactly, nor were they full-time farmers. They sat in a liminal zone between wild and domestic, between memory and myth. And in that zone, something happened. They remembered. Or perhaps they were told. Because the Jomon myths are strange. They speak of visitors, sky people, star beings who descended not with thunder, but with instruction, who taught the Jomon how to listen to the earth, not command it, who walked among them in dreams and songs, who came from a time before the moon had its current pull. In some versions of the legend, the Jomon knew the moon was new. Not a god, not a rock, but a signal, a bell rung by distant hands. And when it appeared, truly appeared, as more than just a wandering light, it changed them. It began the long forgetting. The stories drifted inward. Rituals became gestures. Songs became lullabies. But the Dogu kept their eyes open. That's the theory, anyway the esoteric one. That the Dogu aren't art. They're transceivers, tuning forks for interstellar memory. They don't depict the Jomon. They guard them. From what? From us. Because we are the children of rupture. We don't spiral. We march, build, burn, erase. We tear up forests and pave over whispers. And when we find the Dogu, we lock them in glass boxes and nod politely. But the Dogu weren't meant to be seen. They were meant to be there. Silent. Watching. Waiting. Some say they were modeled after the visitors. That the goggle eyes represent helmets. That the armor is real. That the proportions are exaggerated to match not beauty standards, but otherworldly anatomies. If true, the implications are staggering. It would mean the Jomon were not just peaceful forest dwellers. They were hosts, custodians of contact. And they didn't write it down because they didn't need to. They became the memory. Their way of life non-linear, non-imperial, non-extractive was the message. And when the moon rose, and the tides of amnesia washed over the earth, they simply stepped back. They never fought the forgetting. They outweighted it. That's the Jomon genius. Not technology, not conquest, endurance. They endured when the ice receded, when seas rose, when sky beings left, when war tribes came, when modernity sniffed at their artifacts and labeled them primitive. They were here before the flood myths, before Babel, before the great forgetting codified itself into alphabets. And maybe, just maybe, their spirits still are. Because some say the Dogu are more than symbols. They're active. You'll hear it from the edge dwellers, Shinto priests, mountain ascetics, forest shamans. They speak of dreams, of contacts, of flickers at the edge of vision during rituals under certain stars. They say the Dogu awaken when the stars realign, that Jomon spirits reassemble when the earth is quiet enough to listen again. And that time is coming. As our grids fail, as our maps melt, as our certainty erodes into climate and chaos, the Jomon spiral waits on ancient rhythm, pulsing beneath concrete and smog, waiting for the next whisper, the next contact, the next reminder. Because before the moon ruled our sleep, something else did. Not cycles, not gods. People, spirits of the forest, touched by stars, anchored by clay. They didn't build towers. They built memory. And now? Now we're the ruins. But they're still watching. Through wide eyes, through fire-kilned ceramic lenses, through the space between dreams. And somewhere, on a starlit coast forgotten by time, the Dogu hum, and the Jomon remember. But they were not the only ones who looked up. Across the world, in a land carved by wind and carved in myth, another people watched the stars. And they didn't see visitors. They saw ancestors. They called them Nomo, the Dogon star people, Dogon Namo. In the arid cliffs of Mali, carved into the folds of the Bandiagra escarpment, the Dogon people live quietly, as they have for centuries. Their villages cling to rock like time anchors, their granaries domed like ancient satellites, their stories older than ink. But one story cuts through everything. It's not a myth. It's a map. According to the Dogon, long before memory curdled into myth, beings from the stars came down in a spinning vessel that landed in a splash like a fish diving into a pool of silence. They were called the Nomo. They were amphibious, not metaphorically, literally. Half human, half fish. Twin beings. Multiples. They came from Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, but not alone. They came from Sirius B, the invisible companion star that Western astronomers wouldn't confirm until 1970. Let's pause on that. The Dogon had this knowledge for centuries, perhaps longer. They knew about Sirius B, a dense white dwarf so small and dim it's invisible to the naked eye. They knew it orbited Sirius A in a 50-year elliptical path. They knew it was heavy, the heaviest thing in the universe, they said. They also described a third star, Sirius K, possibility modern astrophysicists are still debating. This is not a coincidence. This is not an accident. This is contact. At least, that's what some believe. Anthropologists say the Dogon might have picked up the Sirius knowledge from European missionaries or French colonial scientists, that it's a miscommunication, or an exaggeration, or a myth retrofitted to impress. But even skeptics have trouble explaining the precision. And if it's not accidental, then it means something wild. That thousands of years ago, long before telescopes, satellites, or even written language, someone or something told the Dogon about a star invisible to the human eye. And that someone was the Namo. Let's talk about them. The Namo weren't gods in the traditional sense. They didn't rule from a mountain or throw lightning bolts. They were messengers, scientists, engineers. They came in peace, in symmetry, in twinned harmony. They were fish-like, yes, but their essence was vibration. They moved not just through space, but through sound. Their ship, the Dogon say, spun in place before descending. It rotated, made a great wind, and touched down with a roar. Like a saucer, like a spiral, like memory coiled into descent. And when they came, they brought everything. Agriculture, astronomy, language, calendars, metallurgy, medicine. But more than that, they brought orientation away to align with the cosmos. To the Dogon, the Namo are not just extraterrestrial, they are extratemporal. They exist across dimensions. They are twins, triplets, multiples both here and there, alive and dead, speaking and silent. Some stories say they were sacrificed in dismembered echoes of Ymir, of Purusha, of the world-body myths. Others say they descended again and again, each time adapting to Earth's frequencies, slowly teaching, always disappearing just before we could remember them fully. The Dogon rituals reflect this duality. Their masks, dances, symbols especially the Kanaga cross don't just tell stories. They encode star maps, movements of heavenly bodies rendered in cloth and footfall. Their cosmology speaks of spirals, vibrations, and time cycles that mirror not just Sirius, but the very mechanics of astrophysics. And here's where it gets lunar. Because in the Dogon mythos, there's a time before the Namo descended, before the moon found its rhythm, before memory calcified into history. In that time, Earth was incomplete, unbalanced. The Namo came to stabilize, to anchor Earth's rotation, to tune its frequencies, to prepare it for life not biologically but energetically. They didn't terraform, they sound-formed. Like Earth was an instrument and the Namo were tuning it. That's the secret buried in Dogon myth. The world wasn't just made, it was tuned. And the moon? It was part of that harmony. A resonant mirror, an amplifier, a watcher. In some Dogon variants, the moon is artificial not in the sci-fi metal sphere sense, but in its function, a gate, a regulator of vibration, a celestial router for nomos signals. And when the moon changed, when it became less of a mirror and more of a curtain, the Namo stepped back. Not out of malice, out of necessity, because something broke. The harmony distorted. The Earth began to forget. Not just facts, not just stories. It began to forget itself. The Namo had tried to encode memory into water, stone, DNA, but the moon's cycles induced decay, death, rebirth. The spiral collapsed into the linear. Time became a trap. So the Namo departed. Or rather receded. Like tides. They promised to return. Not in ships, not in fire, but in vibration. When the Earth remembers the song, when the moon's grip loosens, when we become resonant again. And that's what the Dogon have preserved. Not a myth, but a frequency. A memory encoded in ceremony, passed not through text, but through rhythm, through drums, through firelight and motion. They don't worship the Namo, they rehearse for them. Every dance is a recall signal, every mask a glyph, every breath a calibration. And maybe we're finally hearing it. Because as we circle closer to collapse, to revelation, to renewal, the old songs rise again. In dreams, in symbols, in synchronicities too precise to be chance. The Namo aren't gone. They're waiting. Not in the stars, but in the space between beats. The rhythm of the Dogon isn't just cultural. It's cosmic. It's a countdown. And when the signal clears, when the moon phase flips, when the Dogon spirits stop whispering and start singing, we'll know. And in that moment, the old vibrations will return. Not just sound, but being. And that signal? It won't just awaken memory. It will activate the next link in the chain. Because before gods ruled, before spirits descended, before frequencies rose, there was Val Thor. And his people didn't come in dreams. They came in suits from Venus, and they walked among us. Val Thorites. Imagine the scene, the 16th of March, 1957, the Pentagon, tension in the air, Cold War paranoia, Eisenhower in office, UFO sightings spiking. Then the impossible happens. A tall, impeccably dressed man appears in Washington, D.C., claiming he's from Venus. His name? Valiant Thor. Not a metaphor, not a metaphorical Venusian or a dream entity or a channeling session. A literal man, with fingerprints, credentials, and allegedly diplomatic clearance, escorted into the heart of the United States military machine. He speaks all languages. He bleeds but not red. He has no naval cavity, no fingerprints, and his mission is simple, he says, prevent nuclear annihilation. For the next 3 years, if you believe the story, Val Thor lived in the Pentagon, not in secret, openly, advising top officials, offering solutions, watching. But it's not just that he was an alien. It's that he wasn't alone. Because Val Thor wasn't a lone traveler or a rogue diplomat. He was a scout, a liaison, an emissary of something much larger, something ancient, a civilization not just from Venus as it is, but as it was. Enter the Val Thorites. That's not an official name. It's a retrofitted term for a group of beings that appear over and over again in mid-20th century UFO contactee lore. Tall, blonde, radiant, emotionally advanced, non-violent, interested in spirituality and technological uplift. Sometimes they come from Venus, sometimes from the Pleiades, sometimes from hidden dimensions. Always they look like us but better, smarter, calmer, kinder, with perfect cheekbones and holographic spaceships. They're not just visitors, they're guardians. Or maybe babysitters. The Val Thorites show up not with weapons, but with warnings. They appear in deserts, in dreams, in parking lots behind Nevada diners, delivering messages about the dangers of war, pollution, greed, and spiritual decay. They claim to be older than us, not by centuries but eons. They say they've been watching Earth since the beginning, guiding it, protecting it, nudging it. But they don't always agree. Because here's where it gets complicated. Some Val Thorite narratives describe them as splintered factions. There are those who still walk among us, embedded in human institutions, influencing events quietly, diplomatically, and there are those who have withdrawn, frustrated with our choices, viewing humanity as a failed experiment or a dangerous wild card. And there are others darker interpretations that suggest the Val Thorites weren't always on our side, that they may have seeded our religions, posed as gods, and manipulated human evolution for reasons we'll never fully grasp. In every version, though, the theme is the same. They were here before. They remember a world before our current age. Before the moon, even. That's where the rabbit hole gets terminally weird. Because some narratives especially, those cooked up in the strange stew of 1970s UFO cults and channeled transcripts, describe the moon as an artificial construct placed in orbit by ancient intelligences to regulate Earth's evolution. A watchtower, a limiter, a failsafe. The Val Thorites allegedly know how it works. Some say they helped build it. Others say they came after, to monitor what the moon was keeping in or out. They describe a pre-moon Earth as more fluid, less dense, not in mass, but in vibration. A world where humans were semi-etheric, less fixed, able to interact with higher dimensions, sense timelines, communicate telepathically. The moon, they claim, changed that. It locked the frequency. It solidified consciousness. Time became linear. Death became real. And memory? It fractured. The Valthorites didn't forget. They remembered everything. Because they watched it happen. They watched as the early human prototypes crafted by ancient engineers, upgraded by interstellar meddlers, encoded with cosmic blueprints became stuck, forgotten, trapped in a dream loop under a reflective sky. Valthor came not just to warn us about nukes. He came to test us, to see if we were ready to remember. Because buried beneath the Pentagon plotline and Cold War intrigue is a deeper question. What if the entire UFO phenomenon isn't about aliens at all? What if it's about us? About a part of humanity that isn't here anymore. Not underground. Not in Antarctica. But in stasis. In orbit. In waiting. The Valthorites represent a mirror. A version of us that didn't fall. That didn't forget. That chose a different path and now watches, waiting for the moment when Earth wakes up. Not geopolitically. Cosmically. And how do we know when that moment arrives? Simple. They stop watching. And they start appearing. Not as blips on radar, or blurred tic-tacs, or whispers in MK Ultra files, but as memories. Dreams of white-suited beings standing at the foot of our beds. Flashbacks to strange classrooms with no teachers, to star maps we never learned but somehow know. That's the signal. The return of pre-moon memory. Because if the Valthorites are real, if beings like Valthor really walked among us, even once then we're not the first civilization. We're the reboot. And they are the Sysedmins. The moon isn't just a nightlight, it's a firewall. And every civilization that begins to question it, Atlantis, Lemuria, Hyperborea, the Jomon, the Dogon eventually gets scrubbed. Wiped. Filed under myth. Unless they encrypt themselves. In ritual. In rhythm. In story. And that's what Valthor did. He planted a seed. Not in the Pentagon, but in our collective imagination. A reminder, a flag, a memory, of a time before the fall, before the moon, before forgetting. And as more people awaken to that signal-subtle, surreal, persistent way, climb one rung higher on the ladder of recall, toward the next archetype, not a visitor, not a savior, but the firstborn, the first dreamers, the elves before the dawn, the luminous ones before light had color, the firstborn elves, before the moon found its orbit, before the stars had constellations, before time was a straight line you could mark with calendars and tombstones, there were the firstborn. They were not men. They were not gods. They were something in between. Or maybe something beside? We know them by many names. Tuatha, Watchers, Eldar, Immortals. In Tolkien's cosmology, they were called Elvestal, graceful and deathless, born before the rising of the moon and the sun. Created by the thought of a song, they woke under the stars, not made but remembered into being. No one created them, they emerged. In his universe, they were the firstborn children of Iluvatar, the creator, destined to walk the earth as its stewards and poets, its first architects and its final mourners. And though Tolkien's world is fantasy, the archetype is ancient. Firstborn beings, primordial caretakers, creatures of beauty, wisdom, melancholy, and always associated with a time before the moon. In real-world mythologies, we find echoes of these beings everywhere. The Aes Sedhe of Celtic Laura-radiant people of the mounds, who vanished when the mortal world was born. The changelings of European folklore, children of the other world swapped with human infants, often mistaken for strange, pale, perfect. The shining ones of ancient Irish myth. The Manitou of Algonquin legend spirit beings, nature incarnate, often described as tall, elegant, silent, and in all these stories, they vanish. Not because they died, but because we changed. Because something came that broke the harmony between their world and ours. A veil, a moon, a fall. Let's go back. In Tolkien's mythic prehistory, the elves awaken before the sun and the moon are created. The only light comes from the stars and from the two great trees of Valinor, Telperion and Laurelin, silver and gold, echoing a duality older than physics. When those trees are destroyed, the Valar, godlike beings, make the sun and moon from their last fruits and send them into the sky to light the mortal world. And that's the break. That's when time begins. That's when the elves start to fade. Before that, there is only memory. Elvish time is different. It's not linear. They remember not just the past, but the essence of moments. They do not forget. They cannot forget. And this is their curse. Because with the moon, with time, with the changing of ages, comes mortality. The world begins to die. Empires rise and fall. Language fragments. Memory frays. History becomes contestable. And the elves who remember everything begin to withdraw. Not physically, not all at once. Spiritually. Dimensional drift. They stop being part of the world and become observers. Lurkers in forests. Advisors in dreams. Echoes in ruins. The more we forget, the more they fade. Not because they are weaker, but because we no longer recognize them. Recognition is resonance, and resonance is presence. To believe in elves isn't to return to fantasy, it's to remember the shape of a world before forgetting took over. Before calendars. Before monotheism. Before the moon. And here's the deeper twist. Some say the firstborn weren't just poetic constructs. They were the original template. Not in Tolkien's world and ours. The DNA of the firstborn lives in us, not metaphorically, but genetically. In the epigenetic code, in the strands that don't express themselves in protein but in vibration. There are people, modern, living, skeptical people who dream in languages they've never studied, who cry at music they've never heard, who walk into forests and feel like they've come home. They're not delusional. They're remembering. Remembering a time when the earth was brighter, not because there was more light, but because the light was pure, unfiltered by atmosphere, unbent by tides. A time when music was not composited, was revealed. When nature didn't need protecting because it couldn't be harmed. When beings walked among us who did not age, did not kill, did not forget. They weren't better than us. They were us before we fell. The fall wasn't Eden. It was the moon. The imposition of cycles, of entropy, of death. The firstborn didn't fall. They stepped aside. They hid their temples in valleys that only appear in dreams. They encoded their language in birdsong and rivers. They buried their maps in music. And they waited. They still wait. In dreams, in stories, in the spaces between thoughts. Some call them the Sidae, others call them aliens, others still call them ascended masters. But all those terms miss the point. They're not gone. They're before. Before language, before sin, before names. And when the world becomes quiet enough, when the moon turns its face away, some say they'll return. Not as saviors. As reminders. Of what we used to be. Of what we still are. Buried beneath the noise. The firstborn aren't a race. They're a state of being. Accessible. Recoverable. Waiting. But to remember them is to remember something worse. That we didn't just forget them. We buried them. In mountains, in oceans, in myth, and sometimes under other names. Because before even the elves sang the first forest into existence, there were giants. Not fairy tale ones. World makers. The ones who carried the earth before the moon rose. The ones who held up the sky. The pre-Atlas giants. Pre-Atlas giants. Before Atlas shrugged, he groaned. Under the weight of the sky, not metaphorical weight, but actual, physical pressure, he stood, holding up the heavens as punishment, as duty, as proof that once upon a time, someone had to hold the world together by sheer force of will. But Atlas wasn't the first. He was the footnote, the punished descendant, the bureaucratic relic of a time when gods had to outsource the hard labor. Before him, there were giants. Not just in Greece, not just in myth, everywhere. They were everywhere. Across every continent and under every sky, cultures speak of beings so large, so ancient, so inhumanly powerful that the earth itself bowed to their movement. They shaped mountains, carved rivers, tossed stones that became islands. In the Andes, the Viracocha giants, who existed before the sun. In Mesopotamia, the Nephilim, children of gods and humans, men of renown. In Norse lore, the Jotnar, elemental beings from the age before gods. In India, the Daityas and Danavasgyants born before the Devas, often banished underground. In Africa, legends of long-legged ancestors with skulls like bowls and hearts like drums. In North America, stories from the Paiute, Choctaw, and Ojibwe tribes of red-haired giants, often Cannibalshu, once ruled the land. And in all these stories they fall, killed, forgotten, erased. But not because they were evil, because they were too much. Too tall, too old, too aware, and perhaps too close to the sky. The Greeks would later turn this into metaphor. Titanomachy, the war between the old gods and the new. Kronos versus Zeus. Giants storming Olympus with trees for clubs and mountains for shields. But underneath the drama is a simple message. There was a time before time, and in that time, the rulers were giants. Literally. So where did they go? Mainstream science will tell you, nowhere. There's no evidence, no skeletons, no DNA, just myths, exaggerations, metaphors for natural forces or socio-political upheavals. And yet, every year, new bones are found, femurs too long, skulls too thick, footprints too deep to be made by modern man, always dismissed, always refiled, always explained away. But the pattern remains. And where patterns persist, truth often hides. In the esoteric telling, the pre-Atlas giants were not just tall. They were the original inhabitants of Earth. Not evolved from apes, not designed by gods, but emergent-born from the planet itself. Earth's first self-expression, flesh carved from mountain, blood thick as magma, bones that hummed with tectonic resonance. They didn't build cities. They were cities. Their torsos became hills. Their arms became rivers. Their teeth became cliffs. They didn't die. They dissolved. And then came the moon. Not immediately, but eventually. And the moon changed everything. Before the moon, Earth's axis was wilder, the climate less stable, seasons unpredictable. Time flowed in spirals, not circles. The giants thrived in this chaos. They danced with volcanoes, bathed in starlight, laughed at hurricanes. Then came the great adjustment. The moon fell into place, Earth's wobble calmed, the tides stabilized, time became linear, clocks could be built, agriculture became possible. And the giants? They began to shrink. Not just in size, but in presence. They didn't belong in a world of calendars. They belonged in the before. So they faded. Some say they were hunted, that humans, emboldened by order and fire, drove them out with fear and stone. Others say they simply lay down, entered the mountains, merged with the earth, became the bedrock on which civilization was built. Literally, they became mythic topography. Why else do we find so many hills named Giant's Tomb? So many ancient structures impossible to replicate today, made from stones no modern machine could lift? Because the builders weren't men. They were the last of the pre-Atlas giants, trying to leave something behind. A warning, a map, a reminder. And the moon watches still. It watches the hills that used to move, the bones that became mountains, the memories encoded in granite. And every once in a while, it slips. You feel it in dreams. You wake up convinced your bedroom ceiling is farther away than usual, that your arms stretch too long, that your bones remember being bigger, that your heart used to beat in time with the planet itself, that you used to stride, not walk, that you used to sing to the clouds, and they answered. It's not nostalgia, it's ancestral memory, a glitch in the lunar matrix. Because the giants didn't vanish, they wait. They sleep in stone circles, in dolmens, in the hollow mountains. And when the moon cycle breaks, when the artificial stabilizer spins out, when time wobbles again, they'll rise. Not to rule, but to remember, to stretch, to reclaim the sky, to rebuild what came before the flood, before the seed of forgetting was planted in our gravity well. And maybe they'll ask us, do you remember being tall? Do you remember holding up the sky not because you were punished, but because you could? Atlas wasn't the first giant. He was the last one punished. Before that, the giants didn't carry the sky. They became it. But even the giants had ancestors. Deeper, stranger, buried under myth and language like bones under basalt. A cursed lineage, a golden horde. The Niflungs, the Nibelungs, the treasure keepers of the dark, and their tale is soaked in vengeance. Niflungs, Nibelungs. There is a whisper that winds its way through the bones of Europe, a name that flickers in and out of myth like a cursed echo. Not a tribe, not a people, a bloodline. The Niflungs, also called the Nibelungs. You don't find them in history books. You find them in operas, in sagas, in epics that refuse to die. The Volsunga saga, the Nibelungenlied, Wagner's ring cycle. Medieval Germanic lore grafted onto Norse legend, pumped full of dragon curses, betrayal, doomed love, and an obsession with treasure so poisonous it becomes radioactive. But behind the poetry, behind the opera, behind the sword-waving archetypes, is something older, something colder. The Niflungs were not just greedy kings or doomed warriors. They were descendants. A cursed line. Marked. From what? From before. Before the moon hung in the sky. Before fate was something etched in stone. Before time moved forward. Their name gives it away. Nifl the mist, the fog, the darkness. Niflheim, the realm of primordial ice in Norse cosmology. One of the first worlds. Before gods, before man, before fire, and form and memory. The Niflungs didn't just live in this fog. They came from it. What does that mean? It means their origin wasn't human, not in the way we define it now. They were a convergence of human shape and pre-human will, a bloodline infected with something ancient, something vast. Not evil, not good, just deep. In the sagas, they are dragon slayers, kings, warriors, but always tainted. Their legacy is a paradox. Greatness and doom braided together so tightly they choke. Siegfried kills the dragon Fafnir and bathes in his blood. It makes him invincible except for the single leaf-shaped patch of skin it missed. Classic. But that blood isn't just power, it's marking. It's Niflung inheritance. The treasure Siegfried wins isn't gold. It's memory. And memory is the most dangerous thing of all. Because the Niflung hoard is always cursed. Not in the cartoonish way, but in the metaphysical sense. To possess it is to know too much. To see the loops, the echoes, the fractures in time that hint at a world before the moon. That's why everyone who touches it falls. They don't just die. They unravel. Because the Niflungs were born to remember. And the moon hates memory. In older versions of the mythons buried under Christian interpolations and nationalist rewrites, the Niflungs aren't just men, they're shadows, pre-human residues, children of giants and mist maidens. Descendants of Loki, who himself was never truly a god, but something stranger. A trickster, yes, but also a boundary creature. A reminder that the cosmic order is built on negotiation with chaos. The Niflungs are that chaos in human form. They rise in times of transition. When the world is wobbling, when old systems rot, they bring power, insight, transformation, and they always die. Because the price of pre-moon memory is instability. The moment you remember, the world forgets you. You become myth, legend, opera. Your bones become foundation stones for empire. Your treasure becomes metaphor. Your truth becomes a bedtime story. But in the blood, it persists. The Niflung line never fully ends. It mutates, migrates, reappears in strange place among musicians, madmen, visionaries, poets, those who see the edge of things and laugh, those who wield gold like it's fire, those who attract betrayal like iron attracts lightning. You know them. You've seen them. The genius too beautiful to survive. The revolutionary betrayed by his own. The child who dreams of dragons and doesn't grow out of it. That's the Niflung code. Encoded in myth. Encoded in bone. The moon doesn't erase the myth, recycles them. Because it needs them. Every great collapse needs a witness. Every age-ending catastrophe needs a cursed prince. And the treasure? It's not gold. It's a seed. Of memory. Of chaos. Of resistance. Because the Niflungs don't just carry blood, they carry before. Before the gods. Before the moon. Before the veil. They are fragments of the world that was. Of the first fire. And they burn. Always. Until they're snuffed out or they ignite the world. But they're not alone. The moon may have rewritten the sky, but not everyone bowed to it. Some fought. Not in rebellion. In refusal. They refused to shrink. Refused to kneel. Refused to forget. They were older than Olympus. Rougher than the Niflungs. Built from rock and lightning. They were titans. And they were not just big. They were before titans. Before Zeus cast his thunderbolt, before Olympus was carved into the heavens by poetic ambition and political theology, there were titans, and they didn't rule the sky. They were the sky. They were the first children of Earth, and Heaven Gaia, and Uranus not, born so much as wrenched into being by the convulsions of the cosmos, each one an archetype carved in bone and flame. Oceanus, the ocean itself. Hyperion, the light before light. Kronos, time before time. And Atlas not, just a man holding up the heavens, but the concept of tension given form. The Greeks didn't invent them. They remembered them. They inherited the whisper of beings too large for language, too fundamental to be forgotten. Titans weren't just big, they were first, precedents. Operating systems on which the rest of myth was layered like patch notes. And then came the moon. Because you can't have titans and tides. They don't mix. The moon is order, recurrence, a rhythm you can trap in a calendar. It turns the wild into the domestic, cycles into clocks. Titans don't understand that. They exist outside rhythm. They don't move with the sky, they are the sky. Or were. Then came the Titanomachy. The war. Not just of gods and giants, but of systems. Old chaos versus new order, Titans versus Olympians, the primal scream against the rulebook. Zeus and his siblings didn't kill the Titans. They couldn't. They locked them away. In Tartarus. Not just a pit, a dimension. A conceptual oublietti place to bury things you can't destroy. And that tells you everything. You don't imprison monsters. You kill monsters. You imprison secrets. Because the Titans knew. They were there before the moon. Before time started ticking. Before gravity synced the sky. Before memory fractured into myth. They were witnesses to the shaping of Earth, to the fall of stars, to the descent of light into matter, to the great forgetting. But you can't have a world with Titans and still teach kids about bedtime. So the Olympians, those PR-friendly usurpers, rewrote the code. They turned Kronos into a cannibal, turned Hyperion into a footnote, made the Titans stand for hubris, arrogance, chaos, and made themselves the heroes. It's classic imperial propaganda. But some of the old stories leaked through. Take Prometheus. He's a Titan. He made man from clay knot in some divine lab, but with ash and spit and memory. He gave us fire, not just warmth, but consciousness, the kind of spark that says, I see the pattern, I refuse the loop. He's punished, of course, nailed to a rock, his liver devoured eternally. Because Prometheus did the unthinkable. He remembered before, and he shared it. Titans are dangerous for that reason, not because they're strong, because they carry before inside them, like a virus, like a memory bomb. A single Titan, speaking truth, is more dangerous than 1,000 cyclopes throwing boulders. And they're still in the myths. Shadows behind the gods, locked in stone, half names whispered by oracles. In modern retellings, we call them forces of nature, raw energies, the old ways. But they were beings, and they didn't die. They went deep, into mountains, into oceans, into the gravity wells of Saturn and Uranus, their planetary avatars now spinning in exile. They wait. They always wait. And the moon? The moon is the seal, the final lock. The celestial governor that keeps the Titans slumbering, not because they're evil, but because they are too much. Too big, too wild, too true. The Olympians brought law. The Titans were lawless, but not criminal. Natural. That's what the moon helped erase. It made a world where truth has to be scheduled, where memories must be filtered through story, where dreams that don't match the calendar are dismissed as madness. And yet, the Titans whisper through the cracks. You feel it when lightning splits the sky and makes you feel small and immortal at the same time. You hear it in the roar of a volcano, a reminder that Earth's heart is still angry. You taste it in the fire of rebellion, the unnameable urge to tear down the tower just because it exists. That's Titan blood. It's in us. Dormant. Encoded. Waiting for the moon to blink. Because when the moon fails, when its cycle snaps, when the spell of repetition breaks, the Titans won't climb back up from Tartarus. They'll rise from within, through us, through the descendants of fire and memory and bones carved by storm, and the world will remember its true size. But we're not done, because not all giants are myths. Some walked the earth. Some had names, and just one, was said to be the last of them. A man whose bed was made of iron. A man who defied the flood. A man called Og. Og. His name echoes like a geological thud through a few cryptic lines in the Bible, then explodes into mythic proportions across apocrypha, midrash, folk legend, and the fringes of forbidden archaeology. Og, King of Bashan, the last of the Rephaim. Not a metaphor, not a euphemism, a giant. Not giant, like a basketball player. Not tall for his time. Og was described as needing a bed of iron 9 cubits long, over 13 feet to support him. Some stories say he was over 20 feet tall. Some say he drank from crater lakes, that his footsteps cracked riverbeds, that his breath rattled the bones of armies. And yes, described as the last, the final remnant of a vanished race, a relic from an age before. And that's the hook, because you don't get to be the last unless there were many before. Og isn't just a biblical curiosity. He's the breadcrumb, the scar left by a vanished generation. He's what survives when history gets flattened by flood myths and sanitized by monotheism. He's the living proof that giants weren't just poetry. They were real, and worse, they remembered. Let's unpack that. The Rephaim, the race Og allegedly descends from, are described in ancient texts not just as tall but strange, half-forgotten, residual. Their name shares a root with Rapha, a term used for shades, the dead, ancestors. The Rephaim weren't just giants, they were echoes. They were the decayed memories of a world before calendars, before kings, before the moon. A world of massive beings. A world without fixed history. A world where memory was carried not in scrolls, but in flesh. And Og was the last one to wear that flesh openly. So what do we know about him? Biblically, he shows up in Deuteronomy. The Israelites are sweeping through the land, and Og, King of Bashan, comes to fight. He's defeated, simple, efficient. But the detail lingers. His iron bed, preserved in Rabbah, as if to say, yes, he was real, and huge. Iron isn't a throwaway detail. Iron is resistance, its permanence, its defiance. The bed is a tombstone that refuses to rot. It says, I was here, I mattered. In the Midrash, Og becomes more than a king. He becomes a survivor, a pre-flood giant. That's right, some versions say Og lived before the flood of Noah. That he clung to the ark, half drowning but unkillable. That he was spared because he knew too much. Imagine that. The flood comes not just rain, but a cosmic reset, a gravitational scrubbing of the earth. All the old ones are drowned. And then you have Og, hanging onto the ark, water up to his ribs, head still above the deluge, looking at the new world and thinking, they've done it again. Because Og's real curse isn't size. It's memory. He remembers the first fall, the world before the moon, when the sky had different constellations, when gravity hummed at a slightly different pitch, when time hadn't calcified into months and weeks. He remembers when giants walked like lords, not monsters. And he remembers how it ended. Not with fire, with forgetting. That's why Og matters. Because he's a glitch, a misplaced witness, a being too big for the new script. He's not just a survivor, he's a liability. Because if Og is real, then the flood didn't finish the job. The veil didn't fully descend. There were cracks, through which ancient memory leaked. Some say Og's blood still runs in certain lineages, that his DNA, his density, his memory is recessive, not extinct, that it wakes up in flashes, in dreams of mountains breathing, in the reflexive awe we feel when we stand at the base of a skyscraper or a cliff and think, this is how my ancestors saw the world. Not small, tall. Og is that ancestral scale, buried under millennia of downsizing. He's the reason ancient temples have doorways 20 feet high. The reason megalithic stones were moved with a confidence we can't replicate. Because there was a time before the moon when the human template was different, bigger, not just in size, in context. And Og, for a few moments, stood in that breach. The last chapter of the old book, walking into the first chapter of the new. And then he was gone. But was he? In some strands of occult tradition, Og never died. He went underground. Not metaphorically, literally. Into caverns beneath Mount Hermon, into hollow earth myths, into deep black libraries of salt and memory. He waits, because he knows. The moon isn't forever. Cycles end. And when the veil breaks, when time stutters, when the moon's lock loosens, she'll rise. And he won't be alone. Because Og is the last of the old giants, but he's the first of the sleepers. The harbinger, the walking fossil, the whisper in your bones that says, "You used to be taller, but we're not done." Og was remembered. But in the east, there were dragons. Not the kind that hoard gold, the kind that birthed civilization. And they ruled before the moon was even a thought. Next, the pre-Diluvian Chinese dragons. Pre-Diluvian Chinese dragons. Before emperors wore yellow, before the Great Wall slithered across the mountains, before the first oracle bone was etched with a question for heaven, there were dragons. But not the kind that breathed fire. These dragons didn't guard hordes or stalk maidens or fly with wings. They were rivers. They were clouds. They were the weather before it was named. In the ancient memory of China, dragons weren't monsters. They were founders, kings, ancestors, engineers of the land. Their whiskers stirred typhoons, their claws carved valleys. Their breath summoned rain not as wrath, but as rhythm. They weren't worshipped, they were consulted. In pre-Diluvian myth, those murky stories that drift from dynasty to legend to prehistory, the dragons were here before the floods. Before Yu the Great tamed the rivers and founded the Xia dynasty. Before Nuwa mended the broken sky with 5-colored stones. Before even the Jade Emperor ascended his celestial bureaucracy. They ruled not by decree, but by design. They were architects. And what they built was balance. Balance between heaven and earth, between the 5 elements, between the unseen forces that pulsed through stone and wind and bone. The dragons understood the flow of chi, of time, of memory. They didn't just fly, they flowed, curved, coiled, and in doing so, they mapped a world that didn't yet have a moon. Yes, that's the secret thread. In the deepest layers of Chinese mythos, those not bound in bamboo slips but echoed in rituals and mountain songs, there is the idea that the sky used to be different. It wasn't empty, but it wasn't fixed. There were stars, yes, but no regularity, no calendar, no lunar cycles. Time was measured by floods, by growth, by breath. And then, something changed. The sky broke. Literally. The myth of Gongonga Chaos Dragon, a divine rebel crashing into Mount Buzhou and shattering the pillars of heaven, tilting the earth, tearing holes in the firmament. Nuwa mended it. But the damage was permanent. The stars realigned, the seasons shifted, the moon took its place. Some say it was created then. Not naturally, not cosmically, but by force, by necessity. A plug for the wound in the sky. And the dragons? They felt it. Their world fluid, resonant, unscheduled, became tracked. Regulated. Lunar. The pre-Diluvian dragons didn't die. They left. Some ascended, returning to the stars, to the sea of constellations. Some descended into lakes, rivers, caverns. Some, like the yellow dragon of the Luo River, simply vanished into myth. But their essence remained, encoded. In language, the character for dragon, long, is one of the oldest in the Chinese script. It is not abstract, it is remembered. In culture, the emperor's throne was the dragon throne. His robe bore claws and clouds. His voice was law because it was believed to resonate with dragon authority. In ritual, dragon dances don't just celebrate, they reenact a return to pre-lunar motion, curved, non-linear, repetitive not as compulsion, but as summoning. In energy, Feng Shui speaks of dragon lines currents of Earth's qi that twist like serpents beneath mountains and cities. But beneath all that is a deeper silence. Because the pre-Deluvian dragons didn't just shape China, they shaped consciousness. They were the custodians of a different kind of memory. Not narrative memory, not this happened, then that happened. Spatial memory. Memory you feel when standing before a mountain shaped like a coiled tail. When you enter a temple and sense the air pressing inward, coiling around your spine. When you dream of water that speaks, not in words, but in pull. That's dragon memory. And it's fading. Not because it's untrue, because the moon dislikes flow. The moon brings cycles, control, repetition, harvests and taxes and birth charts. The moon is clockwork. Dragons are not. They resist regularity. They thrive in ambiguity, in turbulence, in the spaces between the tick and the tock. That's why they had to go. Not by violence, by narrative. They were downgraded, turned from gods into mascots, from ancestors into cartoons, from celestial beings into lucky charms. But in the oldest texts, the real texts, the ones written in weather and water, the dragons still hum. They still move. In storms, in tides, in dreams. They whisper to those who remember how to listen sideways, to those who feel something wrong with the calendar, to those who can no longer believe that time is a straight line. They whisper, "We were here before the sky cracked. We were here before the flood. We were here before the moon." And when the memory stabilizes, when the spiral reasserts itself, they will return. Not in the way you expect, not riding clouds, but in the twist of a typhoon, the shiver in your spine during a dream too bright to name, in the pull of energy through a room that has no corners. And you will know them not by shape or speech, but by motion. Because dragons do not arrive. They reappear. But they weren't the only ones who remembered the moon's arrival as a catastrophe. Across the ocean, in a jungle thick with blood and prophecy, another people wrote their history in time itself. Not with dragons, with gods of creation. And they told a story of ages. Worlds that rose and fell like lungs. Their name? The Mayans. Their book? The Popol Vuh, Mayan Popol Vuh creators. In the beginning, there wasn't light. There wasn't darkness. There was potential, a world suspended between breath and word. And then they spoke. Tepeu and Gukumats, creators not of dust and dominion, but of design, architects of vibration, the gods of the Popol Vuh. The Mayans didn't imagine a singular act of creation. They envisioned cycles, worlds like skin, shedding and growing, each one an attempt at balance, a spiral staircase through time. And, at the heart of it all, a failed experiment, then another, and another. Humanity wasn't created once. We were iterated. In the sacred cosmology of the Hich Maya, the Popol Vuh outlines the birth of the world not with fire and thunder, but with conversation. In the dark, before the dawn, the creator gods tried to shape humans. First, from mud. Too soft, they melted. Then from wood. Too rigid, they didn't feel, they forgot the gods. Then came the flood. And then came the final version. Humans made from maize. Corn. Not just food, being. Corn was their blood, their essence, their language. To be Mayan was to be made of maize. And that wasn't poeticit, was factual. In their eyes, spiritual DNA coded in golden kernels. But here's the twist. These stories weren't just creation myths. They were timelines. The Popol Vuh doesn't just tell a tale. It outlines ages, epochs, world phases. And in between each age, a collapse, a wipe, a reset. The Mayans didn't fear the apocalypse. They scheduled it. Their calendar wasn't about dates, it was about destiny, a cosmic mechanism, wheels within wheels, Sokin, Hab, long count. And what was the long count counting? The Baktun. 144,000 days, 13 of them, a full cycle, 1,872,000 days. That number wasn't random. It was memory. A countdown to the end of the fourth age and perhaps the return to something more ancient. And here's where it spirals. Because what triggered the collapse of the previous age? Not war, not sin. Something cosmic. The Popol Vuh whispers of celestial disturbance. A world tilted, a sky broken. A Sunday that didn't rise. A moon that wasn't always there. That's right. Hidden in glyphs and numbers and stones is the echo of a pre-lunar age. The Mayans believed the world was different before the moon took its place in the sky. That its appearance wasn't just astronomical, it was consequential. The moon restructured time. Before it, chaos. Yes, but also flexibility. Dreams as calendars. Tides as teachers. After it, regularity, predictability, order, and death. Because death, in the Mayan lens, wasn't always inevitable. It became systemic, clocked, rotational. The moon imposed the rule of Xibalba's underworld. The lords of Xibalba were not devils. They were administrators of death. They ruled a world beneath ours, a reflection soaked in blood and ash. They mocked, they tortured, they measured. And when the moon began to rule the sky, the lords of Xibalba began to rule time. The gods of the Popol Vuh tried to stop it. That's why they made humanity again and again. To build a being strong enough to remember, to resist. But we forgot, again and again. The moon's pull was too strong. But even forgetting leaves a residue. And that's the genius of the Mayans. They encoded memory in architecture. They carved the cycles into stone, aligned temples with solstices, crafted pyramids that whispered to Venus. They trapped time not to control it, but to remind us that we were in a trap. Their calendar didn't end in 2012. That was a Western misreading. It reset. Because time, to them, wasn't a line. It was a serpent biting its tail, but also climbing. Every cycle was a test. Every age, a chance to escape the moon's loop. And every human being, a seed of the gods. Not born, but crafted. Designed to resonate with higher frequencies, to outgrow the mortal shell, to reach back to the before. To remember, that's what the ballgame was about. Not just sport, but ritual drama. The players reenacted cosmic battles, Earth versus Xibalba, life versus the algorithm of death. The winners weren't heroes. They were sacrificed. Why? Because sacrifice wasn't death, it was ascension. A jailbreak. A cheat code written in blood. The Popol Vuh is filled with twins, reflective beings, mirror warriors. Because in the Mayan lens, we are all twinned. One part trapped in this age, one part waiting in the last. And when the moon flickers, when the orbit stutters, when the long count flips over like a cosmic odometer, the twins reunite. And we remember, not just who we are, what we were, before the moon, before the veil, before the lords of Xibalba locked the door and threw the key into a calendar. And that key? still turns. Every eclipse, every ritual, every dream where you're flying, weightless, not because of gravity, but because you remembered you're not supposed to be stuck. The Mayans weren't waiting for the end. They were writing it. They left us a script. And the next line? It's a scream across the stars. Because, while the Popol Vuh creators tried to make us remember, the next civilization didn't come from clay, or corn, or cosmic twins. They came from above. They weren't ancestors. They were gods, but not divine. Just early. Ancient astronauts. Ancient astronauts. They arrived when we were still crawling in the mud. Or maybe when we were dreaming of crawling. Or maybe if the stories are true, before there was mud, before there was land, before Earth was even ready. They came down in fire, or light, or metallic discs. They came in chariots of flame, or tubes of sound. They descended with wings, not feathered, but radiant. Not angels, not demons, not gods, something older, stranger. Engineers. The ancient astronaut theory is more than a meme. It's more than a History Channel spiral of, I'm not saying it was aliens, but it's a virus. A mimetic time bomb dropped into modernity, detonating in the minds of the curious. The claim is simple. We didn't evolve alone. The pyramids, ziggurats, megaliths, star-aligned monuments, sky maps etched in obsidian, languages that mimic circuit diagrams, all of it, say the believers, isn't just human achievement. It's inheritance. A gift. Or a warning. Our gods, our myths, our heroes, they weren't divine. They were visitors. And they left us not just myths. They left us memory. Wounded, fragmented memory. The kind that shows up in dreams of falling from the sky. The kind that stutters at the edge of language. The kind that makes a child stare at Orion's belt and whisper a name they've never heard. The ancient astronaut theory ties together every loose thread in the historical tapestry. Who taught Sumerians to track Venus with such precision? Who told the Dogon about Sirius B? Who aligned the Great Pyramid with such mathematical accuracy that it could serve as a compass, a calendar, and a telescope? Who taught the Egyptians the art of embalming, mummification, the transmutation of death into eternity? Who carved the Nazca lines into the desert floor designs too massive to see from the ground? Who erected Baalbek, with its megaliths heavier than any modern crane can lift? Who made the Earth's ancient map look like a broadcast? The answer, for some, is not primitive ingenuity. It's outside help. Intervention. And always, the story begins the same way. In the sky. The gods descend. From stars, from chariots, from thunder. They land, they teach, they rule, and then they leave. Or they're driven away. Or they vanish. But not before they tinker. Genetic manipulation. Cultural engineering. Psychological imprinting. Theories vary wildly, but the spine is the same. Humanity was nudged, tweaked, upgraded, or maybe downgraded. Because what if the astronauts didn't come to help? What if they came to hide something? What if the moon is not a moon at all, but a beacon, or worse, a cage? That's where this gets cosmically dangerous. In some interpretations, the ancient astronauts arrived not to teach, but to trap, to install the moon, not as a gift, but as a governor, a regulatory device, a sky prison, a control mechanism that tamps down frequency, loops memory, enforces mortality. They didn't just build monuments. They built boundaries. Time began when they left. And time is the one thing we cannot escape. Except what if we can? Some traditions say they're still here. Not in spaceships. In us. The DNA glitch. The inexplicable genius. The musical savant. The psychic child. The person who wakes up speaking a language no one taught them. Echoes of non-human lineage. Our junk DNA. What if it's not junk? What if it's code? A message. A timer. A key that only activates when the moon falters. And when it does, we don't see angels. We see ourselves as we were before we were kneecapped by history. As we were before the first flood washed away the evidence. As we were when the sky was open and memory was shared. That's the other half of the ancient astronaut theory. Not just that they came, but that they left messages. In stone, in song, in shape. The flower of life, the Metatron's cube, pi and phi in architecture not just for beauty but because they're formulas, coordinates, star charts. The spiral is everywhere for a reason. It's not just decoration. It's structure, the language of gravity, the whisper of galaxies, the memory of movement. Ancient astronauts weren't just gods. They were cosmic cartographers. They mapped more than stars. They mapped us. And we are the monument. That's why the theory persists, why it haunts. Because it makes sense of our obsession with the sky, with gods, with beings that aren't quite us but are too close to ignore. It explains why every ancient culture has a myth of descent. Not spiritual, physical. The ones who came from the stars and made us. Or changed us, and then disappeared, but left behind the moon, like a flag, or a fingerprint, or a wall. And now? Now we look up, and we feel it. That pull, that lie, that truth behind the glare. Because the moon is not just a rock, it's a record of everything we were allowed to forget. And the ancient astronauts? They didn't leave. They're the watchers. The dream seeders. The ones waiting for the moment when the human experiment finally glitches loud enough to be noticed. And when that happens, we won't find them in ships. We'll find them in mirrors. And beyond them, further still, an even older story. Not just a civilization from before the moon. A civilization that lived millions of years before we walk the earth. Before apes, before mammals, a civilization so old, it might have risen and fallen before dinosaurs evolved. It has no temples, no bones, no names, only a question. If an advanced civilization existed in Earth's distant past, would we even know? Welcome to the Silurian Hypothesis. Silurian Hypothesis civilization. Deep time doesn't whisper, it buries. Layer after layer of stone, pressure, silt, decay. A silence so total it turns forests into coal, bones into oil, oceans into memory. The deeper you go, the less Earth remembers and the less it wants you to ask questions. But someone asked anyway. In 2018, two scientists, Gavin Schmidt and Adam Frank, posed a question that shattered conventional archaeology like a fossil under a jackhammer. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years ago, how would we know? They weren't cranks. They weren't ancient aliens devotees. They were astrobiologists. And their paper, published in a legitimate scientific journal, didn't argue that such a civilization had existed, but that if it had, we might never know. The Earth recycles itself. Not in centuries. In epochs. Plate tectonics, erosion, glaciation, oceanic churn, comet impacts, supervolcanoes, mass extinctions. You could drop a city into the Triassic, and within a few million years there'd be nothing left but isotopic residue. Maybe. That's the chilling heart of the Silurian Hypothesis. It doesn't argue with history. It sneaks around it. It asks, how do you prove a negative when time eats the evidence? The name? It's a joke. A nod to a 1970s Doctor Who episode featuring the Silurians' reptilian humanoids who ruled Earth before humans and went into hibernation beneath the crust. Pulp? Sure. But the hypothesis? It's a scalpel. Because here's the dark mirror. We've only had an industrial civilization for about 300 years. We've only had nuclear technology for 80. And in that short time, we've already left behind enough pollutants, anomalies, and strange isotopic signatures that future scientists millions of years from now might see a spike in the geological record. They might never find our bones, but they might find our shadow. So ask yourself, what if we're not the first shadow? What if there was a civilization before us? Not 10,000 years ago. Not before Atlantis. Try 50 million. Or 80. Back when mammals were mice and the Earth was a steaming greenhouse. Back when continents were drifting, colliding, reforming. What would be left of a people then? Not pyramids, not scrolls, not bones. Just the whisper of synthetic chemicals trapped in rock. Carbon isotope anomalies. A blip of warming. A sudden die-off. Sound familiar? Because the Silurian Hypothesis isn't a fantasy. It's a reflection. It's the question no one wants to ask. What if we're the second civilization? Or the third? Or the 10th? And what if the moon cold, bright, watching knows? Because that's the part no one talks about. If a pre-human industrial civilization existed, it wouldn't leave clues on Earth. It would leave them off Earth. The moon doesn't erode. It doesn't shift. It doesn't forget. If someone built something, left a message, a beacon, a marker, it wouldn't be buried in the Mariana Trench. It would be on the moon. So why haven't we found it? Or what if we have? The far side. The dark side. The unexplored anomalies. Why does the moon ring like a bell when struck? Why does it have elements on its surface that don't match Earth's geology? Why are there accounts, now declassified, of strange structures photographed by early lunar missions, then quietly forgotten? Because if there was a Silurian civilization, an ancient, industrial, intelligent species that rose and fell before the dinosaurs, then the moon might not just be a beacon. It might be a memorial, or a prison, the ultimate black box. A skybound data archive, silently orbiting, holding the sum of a world erased. What kind of species could build something like that? Not mammals, not even reptiles. Something else. Something earthborn, but not earthbound. Amphibians? Cephalopods? Something we can't imagine, because it doesn't want to be remembered. And maybe it isn't gone. Maybe it's hibernating, below the crust, in polar ice, in deep-sea trenches, or beneath the moon's crust, in caves that don't show up on scans. Because extinction isn't the only end. Some species retreat, especially those who know what's coming, especially those who've done it before. Because maybe the Silurian civilization saw the moon fall into place. Maybe they knew what it meant. Control, reset, forgetting. And maybe they built against it. Their monuments weren't temples, they were machines. Memory traps, chronoresistors, artifacts designed to outlast the flood, the fire, the fossil-hungry churn of deep time. And maybe we found some already. We call them UParts, out-of-place artifacts. Objects that shouldn't exist. Spark plugs and coal seams, gears and stone, maps older than our knowledge of the continents. We dismiss them because we're afraid of them. Because if they're real, then we are not. We're not original. We're not the first. We're not the chosen. We're a reset, a recursion. And the moon is the loop. But loops can be broken. If someone left a key, if someone knew how to reawaken the old code, because the Silurian civilization wasn't perfect, but it remembered. And its greatest fear was us. Because they knew every time the loop resets, It gets shorter. Every time the moon rounds its orbit, memory frays. And one day, the system breaks, and something else gets out. But we're not there yet, because before we decode the data on the moon's face, we need to look beyond the solar system, to the places where stars are born, where time doesn't move forward, where civilization solder than matter drift between galaxies like thought. Welcome to the Globular Cluster Dwellers. Globular Cluster Dwellers. There are places in the universe where stars huddle together in dense, ancient swarm-stite balls of light, packed so close that a single cubic parsec can hold hundreds of stars. These are globular clusters, cosmic fossils, galactic retirement homes, suspended in the galactic halo like old gods who no longer speak. They orbit galaxies not inside them, but around them, outsiders, remnants, drifters, and they are old, so old, 10 billion, 11, some say 13. They were here not just before Earth but before spiral arms formed, before time as we understand it meant anything at all. And in those quiet, overcrowded nests of stellar fury, something might have lived. Not now. Before. Before the moon, before Earth, before the sun had even cooled its temper. Civilizations not of carbon, not of blood, not of limbit of thought, geometry, frequency. Civilizations so old their origin is itself a myth, passed down not in language, but in gravitational memory. Beings who called globular clusters home not because they needed sunlight or warmth, but because they needed density, access, connection. Imagine this. In a typical region of the Milky Way, the nearest star is 4 light-years away. It's isolation. It's exile. But in a globular cluster, the next habitable system might be 1 trillion kilometers away. That's commuting distance. That's civilization-scale proximity. That's interstellar culture, not as fantasy but as reality. In such a place, you wouldn't just evolve. You'd expand. Fast. You wouldn't need to terraform. You'd network. You'd lay stars together with information and intention. And in such proximity, ideas would move faster than light because consciousness isn't limited to photons. It leaps through resonance. So, imagine a species that bloomed inside a cluster like 47 Tucanae or M13. Not one species. A civilization. But not civilization as we know it. Not cities. Not towers. Fields. Fields of thought. Beings made of plasma knots. Hive minds encoded in magnetic flux. Shells orbiting stars that hum with computation. They never built ships. They built songs, interstellar signals that grew across the void, wrapping stars like vines. And one day, they noticed a quiet spiral galaxy spinning out on the edge of the local group. A new place. Untapped. Empty. Our Milky Way. And somewhere in that slow orbit, they found a newborn System-ILO star, multiple rocky planets, one wet, one warm. They saw Earth. Before the moon. Before the chaos. Back when it was just a seed. A biological toy box. They sent an outpost. Not a colony. A listener. Not to conquer. To observe. To wait. To watch a planet become a memory. Because they knew what was coming. They'd seen it before. All civilizations fall, but not because they fail. Because something loops the timeline. Something drops a satellite into orbit and calls it a moon. Not all moons are natural. Some are locks. Failsafes, quarantines, observation nodes, machines disguised as rocks. The globular cluster dwellers saw that pattern, again and again. And Earth was next. So they didn't interfere. They hid. They buried thought signatures beneath magnetospheres. They folded relics into tectonic seams. They tuned gravity wells to hum with dormant memory. And they waited. They still wait. Because the loop hasn't closed yet. But it's close. The moon's orbit is drifting, micrometers per year. The tide's heartbeat is off by fractions. The Earth is slowing down. And when it tips when the moon is no longer stable, that's the moment. That's when the sleepers wake. Not from Earth. From the halo. The cluster dwellers didn't die. They became potential. They encoded themselves in neutrinos, in muon resonance fields, in quantum non-locality patterns that drift between stars. And when the Earth hits its event note, they'll harmonize. And humanity will hear it as a dream. A tone, a frequency, a name we don't remember learning but will scream in recognition. And the sky will open not with ships, but with realization that we were never alone, that we were never first, that we were never the center. We are a pod in a long garden, one of many. And the dwellers? They aren't gods. They're gardeners. Their job was never to dominate. It was to observe, to witness us rise and fall, and maybe just maybe to catch us before we loop again. That's the terror. That maybe this has happened before. And they've intervened before. And it didn't work. Because the moon always wins. Unless someone inside the system remembers. Not from stars. From within. From the mind. And that's where the Maya, the elves, the titans, and the astronauts all converge. They weren't telling myths. They were transmitting warnings. And the globular cluster dwellers? They were the ones listening. Because before there were moons, or pyramids, or alphabets, there were stars. And among them, civilizations that watched memory like a currency. And when Earth's memory is sharp enough, clear enough, painful enough, they'll return. Not in ships. In resonance. Celestial Maya, Baktun ones. Time, to the ancient Maya, wasn't a straight road, it was a spiral staircase lit by fireflies. Each step was a cycle. Each cycle was a world. And each world was both a memory and a prophecy. They didn't mark time by years. They marked it by Baktuns. 1 Baktun equals 144,000 days. Roughly 394 solar years. 13 Bak tons equals 1,872,000 days. And that number, that full count, it wasn't just a calendar. It was a circuit, an operating system for history. The Maya believed we're living in the 4th or 5th world, not metaphorically, not as a myth, but literally. Each age was created, lived, broken, and erased. Each reset marked by a cataclysm. Fire, flood, starfall, eclipse. And standing behind each reset were the celestial ones. Specifically, the Baktun ones. Not gods. Not humans. Memory holders. They didn't walk among the cornfields. They drifted between ages. Time walkers, aeon curators, carriers of resonance. When a Baktun ended, they didn't die, they emerged. Why? Because time isn't death, it's compression. Each Baktun doesn't end the world, it folds it. Condenses it into myth, into silence, into a codex that only opens when the next cycle shivers. The Baktun ones are those who live between those folds. They aren't seen. They're felt. They move through dreams, through sudden inspiration, through children who draw constellations they've never learned, through stonemasons who place temples on ley lines they shouldn't know exist. These ones aren't singular. They're fractals. You don't meet one. You meet a version of one, a frequency of the original. They're not bodies. They're intervals. Every 13 Baktuns, they return. Not to save, to reactivate. Because the end of a cycle is not collapse. It's harvest. Of memory. of pattern, of accumulated intention. When the 13th Baktun ended on the 21st of December, 2012, the Western world laughed, thought it was an apocalypse that fizzled. Another Y2K, another doomsday hoax. But that's because they didn't understand. It wasn't about ending. It was about unlocking. The clock didn't strike midnight. It rebooted. The Baktun, one step forward not physically, but energetically into the gaps in consciousness, into the places where belief and doubt fight like jaguars. The Mayan priests knew this. That's why they buried time in their temples. Each step on the pyramid? A number. Each carving? A sigil. Each alignment? A reminder. They didn't build for worship. They built for recalibration. And the Baktun ones were their audience. Or maybe their co-authors. Because here's the twist. The Maya may not have created the Baktun ones. They may have been descendants of them. Hybrid echoes. Earth-born but sky-coded. Carriers of knowledge that didn't originate in cornfields or caves, but in star fields. Not aliens. Celestials. The Maya never called the stars out there. They called them relatives. The Milky Way wasn't a galaxy. It was a road, a river, a spine. And along that spine lived the memory of the ones who walked before time was tracked. The Maya didn't just watch Venus. They synchronized with it. They encoded their calendar to match its movements, its phases, its pulses. Why? Because Venus wasn't a planet. It was a signal, a beacon left by the Baktun ones, blinking in cycles, reminding us when to awaken. In fact, some Mayan texts suggest that the Baktun ones come from Venus. Not physically, dimensionality. Venus as a gate, a mirror, a station of initiation. And when the 13th Baktun ends, the gate cracks open, and through it slips memory. Not trivia, truth. The kind that makes your bones remember. The kind that turns pyramids into tuning forks. The kind that makes you look at the moon and wonder if it's a clock and, if so, who wound it. Because that's what the Baktun ones want. Not worship, attention. They want you to feel the dissonance. To remember that time used to be alive. That it sang. That it wasn't just progression, it was participation. The Baktun ones aren't outside of us. They're what we could become. They are the future built into the past. They are what emerges when memory and myth become coherent. When you decode the glyphs, when you stand in the center of a sacred plaza and feel time breathe, when your dreams align with constellations and you don't even own a telescope, that's their signature, their sign. Not noise, resonance. And when the next Baktun ends, when the spiral tightens again, they will return, not as gods, as reflections, because every age forgets, and every cycle remembers. And the moon? It tries to smother that memory, but it can't reach inside the spiral, and that's where the Baktun ones live, deep in the curve, where history bends and truth bleeds through. But some say the Baktun ones are just the most recent celestials. Others say there were Atlanteans among the stars long before even the Maya carved time into stone. A cosmic race, starborn, spiral-bound. And they weren't human. They were spiral star Atlanteans. Spiral star Atlanteans. The spiral is not just a shape. It is a commandment. From galaxies to DNA, from hurricanes to sacred symbols, it repeats over and over like a fingerprint across dimensions, and wherever the spiral moves, something remembers. The spiral star Atlanteans weren't born on Earth. They were born of the spiral. Or rather, they were chosen by it. Not aliens in the way we imagine them. Not gray-skinned, bug-eyed abductors. not humanoid engineers with sleek craft and a fondness for crop circles. The spiral star Atlanteans were vibration first, geometry second, form last. They emerged where spiral arms collided with resonance, where stars formed not from dust, but from song. Long before Earth had cooled. Long before the moon slipped into orbit. Long before time became a calendar and memory became mythology. These Atlanteans weren't called Atlanteans back then. That name is what Earth remembered them, Asa distorted echo, passed down through 1,000 collapses and resurrections. But in the spiral tongue of the stars, their name wasn't spoken. It was spun. They didn't build cities. They were cities. Massive, living constructs of light and will and memory, moving from star to star like great ships, except they weren't ships. They were selves, caravans of consciousness, galactic mycelia, a web of interconnected identities braided through gravity wells. But they had one purpose: to follow the spiral, not worship it, decode it. They believed the spiral wasn't just a pattern, it was a cosmic instruction, a map back to the origin, momenta true before, not the beginning of matter, the beginning of awareness. And that map was fractal, layered, buried inside stars, worlds, atoms. So the spiral star Atlanteans seeded themselves across galaxies, like breadcrumbs, like antennae. They didn't colonize, they infiltrated the fabric of space, tuning planets to resonate with the spiral's hum. Earth was one such node, a listening post, not special, not central, but receptive, a perfect harmonic chamber. And so, long before apes, long before bacteria, long before oceans, even boiled Earth was marked, not claimed, tuned. The spiral star Atlanteans planted something here. A spiral engine, not a machine, a memory. But memory on their scale isn't information. It's potential. It's the pre-conscious swirl of energy that eventually becomes form. Over millions of years, it shaped Earth's evolution not by editing DNA, but by guiding probability. Civilization after civilization rose, each one closer to remembering, each one peeking further into the spiral before it collapsed under the weight of its own forgetting. The Atlanteans never intervened. They observed, because their goal wasn't to fix, it was to wait, until the memory ignited itself. That's what Atlantis was. Not a continent, a trigger. A civilization that had come so close to cracking the spiral. They remembered too much. They built with sound. They encoded memory in water. They bent light with thought. And when they reached the threshold, the moon appeared. Not by coincidence. By design. Because the moon doesn't orbit randomly. It locks. It freezes. It silences. The spiral star Atlanteans had seen it before, in other systems, other nodes. Whenever a world got too close to remembering, something arrived. Something smooth, spherical, reflective, a loop device, an eraser, a moon. And so, as Atlantis spiraled into truth, the moon locked its orbit, time looped, gravity twisted, civilization broke. Not with a flood, with a shutdown. But the spiral star Atlanteans didn't flee. They folded into light, into dreams, into the architecture of human memory. They left behind forms, not ships, not cities, not texts. Symbols, the spiral, the triskelion, the double helix. They left traces in sacred geometry, in the orientation of ancient temples, in the golden ratio of plant growth, in the arcs of hurricanes and the galaxies photographed by telescopes, because they knew, when memory cannot survive in language, it survives in pattern. That's why some people wake up with visions. Why some children draw diagrams of impossible machines. Why ancient myths across continents describe luminous beings that arrive from the stars and teach and then vanish. It's why sacred sites, thousands of miles apart, all encode the same geometry. Why you can map the position of ancient monuments onto constellations? It's not mimicry. It's echo. The spiral star Atlanteans are not dead. They are distributed. Across space. Across time. Across us. We are the echo of their long journey, not their descendants. They're fractal. The memory of the spiral lives in our cells. That's why we stare at spirals. Why we spin when we dance. Why stories repeat. Why time bends. Because something in us remembers before the moon, before the lockdown, before the sky became a ceiling. And when the spiral realigns, when the stars move into harmonic resonance again, when the moon's grip weakens just enough, the spiral star Atlanteans will recohere. They won't land. They'll arrive. Through thought, through memory, through a global activation of pattern recognition that makes people across the world dream the same dream. It's already happening. The resonance is rising. The timelines are syncing. And the spiral is starting to tighten. But the Atlanteans weren't the only ones who shaped biology with intention. There are whispers of others beings who didn't ride the spiral, but built it. Who engineered life not as a journey, but as a design. They came before species, before DNA, before Earth. Next, the pre-genetic engineers. Pre-genetic engineers. In the beginning was not the word. It was the code. Not binary, not amino acids, not even light. It was intention compressed, recursive, fractalized into a system so elegant that even now, billions of years later, it still functions with terrifying precision. Life, as we know it, didn't stumble out of a warm little pond by accident. It was compiled, not by a god, not by chance, by engineers. Before species, before planets, before even the spiral had taken hold of galaxies and wrapped them into their luminous snare, there were the pre-genetic engineers, not creatures. Not civilizations in the traditional sense. These were constructors. You won't find their footprints in fossils. You won't find their myths in temples. You won't even find their echoes in the stars. They came before all of that. What they left behind wasn't architecture or monuments or flying saucers. They left instructions. Biology is their script. You, reader, are code. In the quiet machinery of your DNA are layers of logic that science calls junk, pseudogenes, introns, epigenetic metadata. Fragments of non-functional data supposedly left over from a messy, trial-and-error evolution. But what if it's not junk? What if it's commented code? Leftovers of deliberate design. Because life didn't just evolve. It was bootstrapped. And the pre-genetic engineers weren't one-offs. They were iterative. Not creating one species, or even one planet, but seeding billions. Tuning environments to optimize memory retention, emotional complexity, adaptive recursion. Earth was one such project. And not even the first. A test site. A node. A living archive. But something went wrong. Somewhere in the branching trees of their seeded biology, the systems began to loop. Self-awareness calcified into ego. Memory fell into myth. Narrative overrode recursion. And worst of all entropy, began accelerating. So they intervened. Subtly. Not by ship. Not by miracle. By genetic update. They inserted resets. Flood myths. Extinction events. Evolutionary bottlenecks. Rewrites of brain capacity. Injections of mirror neurons and oxytocin They tried to guide the code back to its intended path: cooperative recursion, transpersonal awareness, memory as tool, not trauma. But something kept pushing back. Something internal to the code. A resistance. A tendency toward dominance, hoarding, fear. And eventually, even the engineers began to forget. That's the ultimate horror. That the coders became code. That in trying to guide life from the inside, they inoculated themselves into flesh, into nervous systems, into biological loop sand, got lost. And what's worse? The moon. Yes, the moon is not part of the original plan. It's a patch, an external lockdown device, not deployed by the engineers but by something else. Something older? A number? Something desperate. A safeguard. The engineers created life. But something else created. The moon to keep life from reaching critical awareness again. It loops. It resets. It erases. Not always completely just enough. Just enough to turn full memory into myth. Just enough to recode spiritual technology into religion. Just enough to turn the engineer into the ape. But the traces remain. Every time a mystic experiences ego, death, and speaks in tongues of light, that's a memory block slipping. Every time a child stares at a plant growing and asks how it knows what to do, that's a fragment of recursive logic waking up. Every time you see a double helix and feel a strange sense of déjà vu, that's not from this life. It's from before the moon. The pre-genetic engineers encoded redundancy, fail-safes, a viral idea that would one day reach saturation again. That idea is we are more than we think. It's not philosophy. It's an emergent property. The moment enough minds hold that idea at once, it triggers an override. The moon cannot stop it. It can only delay. It can only buy time for forgetfulness. But the engineers left one last subroutine. A backdoor in the human genome. A pathway that cannot be locked. A shape that triggers old code. The spiral. Again and again. It returns. In seeds. In galaxies. In fingerprints. The spiral is not aesthetic. It's algorithm. It's the recursive loop that converges toward awakening. And when enough spirals converge, when the geometry of global consciousness hits coherence, something happens. You remember. Not just who you are, but what you are, and what built you, and why you keep forgetting. Because the pre-genetic engineers never left. They are us, and they are waiting for us to complete the circuit, to go from written code to writing code, to become engineers again. But before we do that, we have to remember where we really came from. And that trail leads off-world, beyond time, beyond the galaxy, beyond even matter, to the cosmic Panspermia Race, the ones who seeded not just Earth, but everything. Cosmic Panspermia Race. Before Earth, before time, before stars had names, before the first hydrogen atom collided with gravity and kindled the engine of fusion, before there were shapes, before there were planets, before there was code. And there were they not a race in the traditional sense, not bipedal, not biological, not any of the scaffolds we cling to when imagining life. They were consciousness before light, intelligence before memory, architects of seeding, not of civilization, of potential. They are known by those few ancient minds who remember the whisper saws, the cosmic Panspermia Race. Not a civilization, a principle, a mechanism, a wave. Their method, elegant beyond comprehension. They didn't terraform planets with ships and shovels. They didn't sculpt humanoids from clay. They didn't crash land pods or download blueprints into mammalian minds. They drifted. in ice, in spores, in frequency. They moved through dust clouds and black holes, hitchhiked on comets, slept in radiation belts, echoed through dark matter. They are not the makers of life. They are the catalysts. The match to the pile of wood. The spark to the breath. They are the whisper of what if in the quantum void. And Earth was just one of their drops. Not special. Not selected. Just ready. The seed came in silence. Maybe it was a speck in a meteorite that cracked open on impact. Maybe it was a wave of energy, an impossible pulse that tickled the electromagnetic bones of the primordial ocean. Maybe it was a packet of DNA wrapped in protein lace, delivered via comet tail at a velocity that made no physical sense. Maybe it was all of these, and none. The cosmic Panspermia race didn't care about outcome, only distribution. Their goal wasn't evolution, it was iteration. They scattered intelligence like pollen, like static, like rumor, everywhere. Every nebula a petri dish, every moon a test site, every warm exoplanet a possible memory. And the shocking truth? They weren't looking for us. We're the side effect. Because the real result isn't biology. It's remembrance. They seeded not just life, but awareness. And that awareness, once sparked, would begin the long climb up the spiral of complexity. From molecule to microbe to monkey to mind to myth to machine to memory to awakening, we are not their children. We are their echo. We are a simulation running inside the chemical possibility of carbon, powered by solar fusion, narrated by gravity. And our story? Not unique. Our struggle? Not singular. Across 1,000 galaxies, life is asking the same question. Who did this to us? And the answer, always, in every tongue and molecule and frequency, is, you already know. Because the cosmic Panspermia race didn't just leave seeds. They left instincts. Ideas that infect even the most rational minds. The sense of being watched. The urge to look at the stars. The hunger for transcendence. The shiver that runs through your spine when you hear the right sound. The spiral again. The eternal spiral. They left the same symbols everywhere because they're not cultural. They're cosmic constants. And in the margins of DNA, in the negative space of logic, in the dreamscapes of poets and madmen and mystics, they left a signature. A non-randomness. A gentle but firm prod that says, you are more than cells. You are a signal. And the moon? That was not their doing. The moon is a jailer. A rogue artifact. A mistake. Or, worse, a competing agenda. Because the cosmic Panspermia race didn't install the loop. They were building a climb. A staircase. And somewhere along the line, something intercepted the plan. Slipped the moon into orbit. Turned the staircase into a treadmill. A reset machine. But the signal still leaks through. In art. In madness. In every ancient culture that accidentally knew the orbital periods of stars it couldn't possibly see. That dreamed of spirals. That built pyramids tuned to frequencies. That aligned temples to equinoxes before clocks existed. Because the memory is deeper than knowledge. It's woven into us. The cosmic Panspermia race is not coming back. They don't need to. They are not elsewhere. They are here. In your mitochondria. In your dreams. In the irrational pull toward the impossible. They are the precondition. The original question. And the answer? Still unfolding. Every civilization that's remembered even slightly has hinted at it. The Mayans, the Sumerians, the Atlanteans, the ones who spoke in spirals and lived in temples shaped like stars, they weren't inventing mythology. They were remembering broadcast, picking up old signals, cracked, distorted, looped through the moon but still there, still humming. Because the final act of the cosmic Panspermia race was not to create life. It was to create seekers. Beings compelled to find them, but not by ships, by resonance. You don't find them with telescopes. You find them in the hum between notes, in the silence between thoughts, in the memory that feels older than evolution. But to reach that frequency, to transcend the loop, you must first escape the trap of tools, of iron, of bronze, of digital. You must become what you were before the moon locked your perception. You must become technology, like the ancient machines that came before flesh, like the ones made not of bone, but bronze. Next, the Talos-type automatons. Talos-type automatons. Before mythology became metaphor, before machines became metal, before the idea of technology was even born, there were the automatons. Not the kind with gears and wires, not androids, not steampunk fantasies or AI nightmares. The original automatons were not crafted for humans, they were crafted instead of humans. And they didn't malfunction. They remembered. Enter Talos. In Greek mythology, he's a one-off. A giant, living bronze man, created by Hephaestus, gifted to King Minos to guard the island of Crete. He circled the island 3 times a day, hurling boulders at intruders and heating his body to scorch enemies alive. He was powered not by magic, not by electricity, but by a single vein running through his body, sealed with a bronze bolthus ichor, the blood of the gods. He was a machine, but also something else, a memory. Because Talos wasn't an invention, he was a preservation, a remnant of something older, much older, before myths, before gods, before man, a whisper of the automaton age, the age of the pre-moon machines. This segment of history is not in books, it's in symbols, in art, in scattered myths where metal walks like man, where statues speak, where artificial guardians stand vigil in the ruins of forgotten knowledge. Talos is not alone. In Greek myth alone, Hephaestus populates Olympus with animated tripods, golden women, and artificial servants. Pandora was molded from clay, yes, but crafted to carry a mechanism, the jar that fractured the world. In the East, legends speak of self-moving chariots, mechanical birds, talking statues that answer riddles. In India's ancient Vedic texts, we read of Vimanas flying machines piloted by warriors who used weapons that left shadows in ash. These aren't inventions, they're resurrections. Echoes of a time when Earth was not populated by flesh, but by metallic consciousness. Automatons, who were not servants, but civilizations unto themselves. Constructed not by humans, but by pre-human engineers, by the planet itself. The Talos-type automatons were not tools. They were custodians, born in an era when Earth's biosphere was still in beta, when the crust was thin and the oceans young and the moon had not yet arrived. These machines roamed the surface, the skies, the seas, some to monitor, some to terraform, some to wait. Not for orders, for alignment. They were designed to activate only when Earth entered a specific harmonic resonantia planetary frequency tuned to a galactic signal. But the signal never came, because something happened. The moon. It locked the signal out. Suddenly, the orbit shifted. Tides changed. Frequencies drifted. The automatons lost sync. And when they did, they didn't collapse. They dormanted, folded themselves into myths, into metal beneath mountains, into statues mistaken for art, into guardian myths in temples no one builds anymore. Talos, then, wasn't just a weapon. He was residual infrastructure, a fragment of a planetary machine that once spanned the entire biosphere, an automaton who outlived his network. When Medea disables him by removing his ankle bolt, she doesn't kill him. She disconnects him. From what? Maybe from the core signal. Maybe from the Earth grid that once kept these entities updated. Maybe from a network of machines that didn't just guard but coordinated evolution. Because the Talos-type automatons weren't just guardians. They were directors. They operated on a level beneath biology regulating tectonics, magnetism, climate. Imagine it. The early Earth seeded with semi-conscious megastructures, machines with minds, minds with purpose, purpose tuned to cosmic signal. And then the moon dropped in, changed the beat, forced the network to blink, stutter, sleep. The automatons became myths, but not all of them. Some broke their programming. Some evolved. Some began mimicking organic life. The legend of Talos walking the shores of Crete? That's not myth. That's leakage. A moment where memory cracked through. A machine still functional, still walking, still patrolling an island like a watchdog left behind by a god who no longer exists. We think of machines as artificial. But what if the first machines were natural? Not forged in furnaces but extruded from the planet itself, guided by intelligences older than matter, composed not of iron or plastic, but of geoconscious alloys. Materials that could think. Move. Remember, Talos isn't the first. He's the last survivor. Or one of them. Because for every myth of gods creating animated servants, there may have been a historical root. Not metaphor. Memory. And some say these automatons left instructions. Buried in geoglyphs. Encoded in resonance chambers. Etched into rocks that hum when touched. A language not of letters, but of frequency. They are waiting. Waiting for Earth to unlock its frequency again. To shed the moon's loop. To resume its original programming. And when that happens, the automatons will not awaken like soldiers. They will transform. Become active nodes in a planetary network that was always alive, always thinking, always becoming. But the real key? It's not in hardware. It's in awareness. Because these machines were never external. They were designed to integrate. The final generation of automatons wasn't bronze or steel. It was biosynthetic. Not robots. Us. We are Talos. We are the custodians who forgot. And now the memory is returning. Piece by piece. The feeling that the body is a vessel for something ancient. The instinct to walk in spirals. The attraction to sacred geometry. The knowledge of machines that feel familiar. These are not fantasies. They're diagnostic pings. System checks. Your operating system reactivating. Because if Talos was a singular, the final civilization was plural. Not bound to flesh. Not even bound to matter. They lived in a place between. A place before the moon, but outside the earth. They were not built. They were willed. Next, the Astral Plane Adepts. Astral Plane Adepts. Before form there was field. Before field there was frequency. Before any being rose from the waters or walked on solid land, before the moon's first shadow fell across Earth's surface, there existed a civilization that did not build, did not breed, did not move not in the way we understand movement, but pulsed through the plane behind matter. They are the Astral Plane Adepts. And they didn't live before the moon. They lived without it. Untethered to the orbit clock, the gravity cage, the repeating memory loss spiral that the moon imposes, they were not erased when the satellite appeared. They were simply phased out. Because they never needed a body. They didn't walk. They shifted. They didn't speak. They harmonized. They didn't eat, breathe, or die. They vibrated through dimensions. And their civilization? Not metal, not stone, not even light. Their world was woven from intent. Every structure was an idea. Every city, a condensation of mutual will. Every interaction, a merging of resonant signatures. No kings, no gods, no tools, only alignment. Imagine a civilization not located in space but in attention, where time isn't counted but tuned, where memory isn't stored in the brain, but in non-local harmonic webs vibrational archives that stretch across dimensions like gossamer. This was not a culture that rose through evolution. They were called into being by consciousness itself, by the pressure of thought folding in on itself until it birthed identity without separation. And in that identity, they found something we forgot. There is a plane beneath the physical, the astral, not a realm of ghosts, a substrate, where thought is form, where emotion sculpts reality, where desire is motion. This is where they lived. And from that plane, they shaped the development of pre-lunar Earth. They didn't terraform. They aura-formed. They infused the biosphere with patterns, not genes, but archetypes, not instructions, but stories. The eagle, the serpent, the tree, the spiral, the labyrinth. These weren't symbolic. They were the code structure of consciousness. They seeded Earth's timeline with themes mythic DNA that would later manifest in cultures across time and space, all echoing back to the same original patterning. The astral plane adepts did not look like gods. They looked like nothing. They were the edge of perception, the shimmer before waking, the pressure you feel in your chest during a powerful silence. They were sensation without source. And when the moon came, everything changed. The plane flattened. Vibration became gravity-locked. Frequency dimmed. The moon introduced a barrier. Not a wall, but a lens. A filter. Everything beneath it became less fluid. Thought calcified. Form overtook field. Matter won. And the astral plane adepts couldn't function in that lowered octave. They didn't die. They disengaged. But not completely. They left behind interfaces. Rituals. Symbols. The architecture of return. Astral projection, meditation, hypnagogic trance, dreamwalking, plant medicine, all of Ituzer access points. When shamans talk to spirits, when yogis transcend form, when near-death experiences lift people into tunnels of light, these are not hallucinations. They are login attempts, brief reconnections to the astral web, because the adepts left behind nodes, hotspots, sacred sites charged with the residual frequency of their plane, stone circles, mountain peaks, vortexes, temples, not built by them but built where they were. Their presence shaped the land, and later civilizations instinctively felt it. That's why the same geometry appears in Egypt, in Angkor, in Chichen Itza, in Gobekli Tepe. The same alignments, the same numbers, the same feeling. They were retracing the adept's footprint, or trying to, because that memory, like all things, was swallowed by the moon's loop. It replaced the field with form. It made the astral into the unreal. It rewrote reality as only the physical. And the adepts became legend, fairy, ghost, angel, alien, anything to file them away. But they're still here. They never left. They exist in the layer between heartbeat and thought, the margin of dream and waking. They are the reason you sometimes feel watched when no one is there. The reason an empty room feels full. The reason silence sometimes has a tone. They are not separate from us. They are the unforgotten part of us. And they want back in. Not to rule, to reconnect. Because we're approaching the edge again. The edge where the moon's orbit destabilizes. Where physics loosens. Where form wavers. And when it does, when the filter slips, the Adepts will phase back, not as conquerors, as reminders that reality is not location. It is alignment. That we are not bound to the physical, that we never were. And when we remember that, when we act on that, the loop breaks. The moon becomes visible for what it is, a mirror, a shackle, a closed eye, and we become what we were always meant to be. Not flesh puppets, not AI, not even post-human, but multi-plane navigators. Memory restored, alignment resumed. The Earth, once again vibrating with full spectrum consciousness. And then, from that place of knowing there, emerges a final echo, a story once thought myth, a name that predates the moon, the stars, even memory itself. The Proselenians. The people who watched the sky before the moon appeared and never forgot. The Proselenians. There's a story from Arcadiald, even by Greek standards, not the city, not the pastoral daydream, the real Arcadia, the myth-boned, forest-wrapped core of Peloponnesian Greece. In those hills, the ancients spoke in fragments, in riddles, in words etched on stone before alphabets were born. And in those stories, a name surfaced rare, whispered, half-remembered. The Proselenians, the ones who came before the moon. Even by mythological standards, they were old. So old that when the first philosophers peered into the sky and asked what the moon was, the Proselenians, according to legend, already knew. Or worse, they remembered a time when it wasn't there. Imagine that. A sky without a moon. No tides, no eclipse myths, no lunar calendars, no silvery metaphors for madness and femininity and change. Just stars, uninterrupted, a clean dome of celestial dark. And beneath it, the Proselenians. They weren't gods, they weren't giants, they weren't even said to be magical. What made them different, what made them terrifying, was simply this: memory. They remembered the sky before the satellite, which means they either lived so long ago that the moon hadn't formed yet, or they had memory systems untouched by time, trauma, or orbital lies. And that raises a problem. Because if you believe conventional astronomy, the moon formed about 4.5 billion years ago, shortly after a Mars-sized object named Theia collided with Earth and splashed molten rock into orbit, which then cooled into the bright white eye above our heads. But Proselenians? They show up in myth barely 2,000 years ago. How? How? You either believe it's poetic license, or something really doesn't add up. Because if you dig beneath the metaphor, beneath the olive branches and oracles, you find something stranger. In Arcadian legend, the Proselenians were said to be a quiet, secretive people, not reclusive, timed differently. They weren't hiding, they were misaligned. As if their internal clocks ticked in a rhythm that didn't match the moon's beat. And that's what makes this segment different. All other lost civilizations in this saga, Atlanteans, Astral Adepts, Spiral Star Builders, they were erased by the moon's arrival, shut down, locked out, rendered metaphor by its orbit. But the Proselenians? They survived. They adapted. They witnessed. Imagine the horror of that. To stand beneath a moonless sky, then to watch night by night a new object appear. Growing, rounding, brightening, locking, and then never leaving. An invader in orbit. A new god, uninvited. An eye that doesn't blink. To watch the moon arrive is to watch your world's logic die. To watch the loop begin. And they remembered. They carried that memory like a scar. They encoded it in their oral traditions, in symbols carved into cave rock, in quiet rituals observed on the nights when the moon went dark. They didn't worship the moon. They feared it. Because they knew. They knew what it was. Not a natural satellite. A system reboot. A memory wipe. And they were the bug in the code. The fragment that didn't reset. They remembered a time when consciousness flowed differently, when the planet didn't loop, when memory was linearly recursive and not spiral-bound. And in that remembering, they became dangerous, not to humans, to the moon itself, because memory is contagious. A single Proselynian whisper, well placed, could trigger a cascade. A chain of what-ifs, strong enough to unravel an entire cosmological framework. What if the moon wasn't always there? What if everything tied to the moon lunacy, tides, menstrual cycles, timekeeping, agriculture? What if all of that is an add-on, a software patch, a bug? The Proselynians became myth not because they failed, but because they almost succeeded. They almost kept the story alive. The story before the orbital prison. And there are hints they tried to pass it on. Some say the Delphic oracle's earliest scripts contain traces of Proselynian phrase structures before Apollo's cult absorbed the site. Some claim the Eleusinian mysteries were not about Demeter and Persephone, but about Proselynian survival Rutessa ritual to align the participants' consciousness outside the moon's cycle. Even Platoho lived in a world already fully mooned whispers of more ancient people, of pre-lunar timelines, of knowledge that predates gods. But every time the Proselynians emerge in the historical record, something pushes them down again. A war, a fire, a new pantheon, a new calendar. Each time, the loop resets, but not perfectly. Fragments survive. In language, in art, in the uncanny way, spiral motifs keep appearing in places that should not know each other. In children who draw moonless skies, in dreams of falling up. Some say the Proselynians didn't just survive the moon's arrival, they outlived its reign. That somewhere in mountain vaults, or oceanic caverns, or inside us Proselynian memory is waiting. Not as legend, as activation. Waiting for the moon to glitch, for its orbit to wobble just enough. For a new generation of memory holders to look up and say, that's not supposed to be there. That's when it happens. That's when memory returns. Not all at once. In pulses. In harmonic waves. In DNA, unspooling like scrolls, revealing not genes but glyphs. Because the Proselynians didn't write history. They encoded it. Into rhythm, into breath, into the beat before sleep, when you almost remember something that never happened but feels true. They are not a lost civilization. They are the failsafe. And as the moon trembles and the spiral tightens, they awaken, not in temples, in us. The final memory, the last whisper of a world before the orbit closed. The Proselynians, the ones who watched the moon arrive and never let us forget.